There is something almost sacred about the idea of rules, not the kind we argue over in courtrooms today, but the first ones, the ones that rose from the earth like ancient stones, marking boundaries no one could see but everyone somehow felt. Long before there were lawyers in wigs or judges behind benches, long before the word justice was written in any language we would recognize, there was simply the need, the human need, to know what was permitted and what was not, to understand the invisible lines that held a community together like the roots of trees beneath the soil, tangled and strong. I find myself thinking about the first person who ever said, "This is wrong," and had others nod in agreement. That moment when a tribe or a village or a family decided together what mattered, what would be punished, what would be forgiven. It must have happened around fires, under stars that looked the same then as they do now, voices low and serious, deciding the shape of the world they would pass to their children. The very earliest laws were not written. They couldn't be, because writing itself had not yet been born. Instead, they lived in memory, in the repetition of elders, in songs and stories that carried the weight of commandment. A young person would learn by listening, by watching, by absorbing the rhythm of right and wrong as naturally as learning to walk. These ancient rules were often tied to the rhythms of nature, to planting seasons and harvest moons, to the movements of animals and the rising of rivers. There was a logic to them that felt almost inevitable, as if the laws themselves were part of the landscape, as essential as water or stone. And then, slowly, across millennia, something extraordinary began to happen in different corners of the world, separated by oceans and mountains. People began to carve their laws into something permanent, into clay and stone and eventually papyrus. They began to make the invisible visible, to give form to the agreements that had floated in air and memory for so long. In Mesopotamia, between two rivers whose names still echo through history, the Tigris and the Euphrates, there arose cities of mud, brick, and ambition, and with them came the need for order on a scale never before imagined. Thousands of people living together, trading, arguing, building, needing to know what would happen if a wall collapsed, or a debt went unpaid, or a fight turned deadly. The earliest written laws we know of come from this place, from Sumer, from Akkad, from Babylon. Their names sound like incantations now, but they were real places, dusty and hot, filled with the smell of bread baking and animals in the streets. And in the center of power, scribes bent over tablets, pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft clay, making permanent what had always been temporary. One can almost see them, these ancient scribes, their fingers stained, their eyes tired from squinting at their work, knowing that what they wrote would outlast them, that centuries later someone would hold that same tablet and read those same laws, laws about the price of grain, about marriage and divorce, about what to do when an ox gores a person, about the responsibilities of builders and boatmen and doctors. There is something deeply moving about the specificity of these ancient codes, the way they reveal ordinary life, not grand battles or heroic deeds, but the daily struggles of people trying to live together fairly. A law about a stolen sheep tells us there were shepherds and thieves and a community that cared enough to decide what justice looked like in that situation. And these laws were not gentle, not by modern standards. They could be harsh, even brutal, but they were also, in their way, a kind of progress, because they replaced the chaos of revenge with something more predictable. If someone harmed you, you didn't have to gather your family and start a blood feud that might last generations. Instead, there was a code, a set of consequences everyone knew, written down, unchanging. The idea that law could be written, that it could exist outside of any one person's memory or interpretation, changed everything. It meant that a farmer could know his rights even if the king was far away. It meant that a merchant could make agreements that would hold even after death. It meant that power, even the power of rulers, could be bound by something larger than itself. The most famous of these early law codes, the one that still captures the imagination after nearly 4,000 years, is the Code of Hammurabi, carved into a massive pillar of black stone, standing taller than a person, its surface covered in the precise cuneiform script that must have taken months, perhaps years, to complete. Hammurabi was a king of Babylon, ruling in a time so ancient that when we try to picture it, our minds struggle to find anything familiar. This was the 18th century before the Common Era, a world where bronze was still precious, where the wheel was a relatively new marvel, where the great pyramids of Egypt were already ancient, already mysterious. The stele itself, this monument of law, shows Hammurabi standing before the sun, god Shamash, receiving divine authority. The image speaks to something profound, the idea that law comes from beyond human whim, that it carries the weight of something eternal, something that cannot be dismissed simply because a new king takes the throne. Below this carved scene, the laws themselves begin, 282 of them covering everything imaginable in Babylonian life. They are organized not alphabetically, not by severity, but by topic, flowing from one area of concern to another like chapters in a book about civilization itself. Reading them now, translated into our modern tongues, we can almost hear the voices of the disputes they were meant to settle. A builder constructs a house and it collapses, killing the owner. What then? The code says the builder shall be put to death, and if the owner's son dies instead, then the builder's son shall die. Life for life, son for son, a symmetry that feels almost mathematical in its precision. This is the famous principle. Lex talionis, the law of retaliation, though we know it better by its biblical phrasing. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It sounds cruel to us now, primitive, but in its time it was actually a limitation, a way of saying the punishment must fit the crime. No more, no less. You cannot destroy an entire family because of one injury, cannot take 10 eyes for one. But Hammurabi's code also reveals the stratification of Babylonian society, the way justice bent depending on who you were. If a person struck someone of equal rank, the penalty was one thing, but if they struck someone of higher rank, the penalty increased. And if the victim was a slave, the penalty diminished. The law acknowledged inequality, enshrined it, made it official. There were laws about marriage, detailed and specific, about the property a woman brought to her marriage and what happened to it if her husband died, about divorce and its procedures, about children and inheritance. We learn that women could own property, could conduct business, could testify in certain cases. Their position was not equal, not by any modern measure, but neither were they entirely powerless. under this ancient system. Medical malpractice appears in the code. If a physician operates on someone with a bronze lancet and the patient dies, the physician's hands may be cut off. The penalty seems savage, but it also tells us that physicians existed, that surgery was attempted, that there was a recognized profession of healing, and that even then, people worried about holding doctors accountable. The wages of laborers are specified. So many grains of silver for a day's work. During harvest, different amounts for different skills. A shepherd, a builder, a boatman, each had an established value for their time. It speaks to an economy complex enough to need such regulations, to markets and trade, and the endless negotiations between those who have work and those who need it done. Far to the west, along the narrow green corridor of the Nile, Egyptian civilization had already been ancient when Hammurabi ruled. The Egyptians had their own concepts of law, though fewer of their legal codes survive intact. What we know comes from fragments, from tomb paintings, from papyri that somehow escaped the moisture and decay that claimed so much. The Egyptians called their guiding principle ma'at, a word that means truth, justice, order, balance, cosmic harmony, all at once. It was personified as a goddess, depicted with a single ostrich feather, light as air, yet heavy with meaning. When a soul was judged after death, the heart was weighed against this feather. And if the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, heavier than the feather, the soul would not pass into the afterlife. This idea that law was cosmic, that it connected the daily dealings of people in markets and homes to the fundamental order of the universe, shaped Egyptian legal thinking profoundly. Pharaoh was not just a king, but a living god, whose role was to maintain Ma'at, to keep chaos at bay, to ensure the Nile flooded at the right time and justice prevailed in the courts. Egyptian law recognized the power of written contracts. Agreements were recorded by scribes, witnessed, stored. A scribe was a person of tremendous importance, one of the few who could read and write in a society where literacy was rare and precious. The scribal schools trained boys for years, teaching them the hundreds of hieroglyphic symbols, the proper forms for different documents, the weight of accuracy. Property rights were surprisingly well developed, even for women. An Egyptian woman could own land, inherit from her parents, make contracts, divorce her husband. These rights were not unlimited, not equal to men's, but they existed. Documented in papyri, we can still read today evidence of individual women who lived 3,000 years ago, their names preserved because they owned a house or filed a complaint. Crime and punishment in Egypt varied by the nature of the offense. Tomb robbery was considered especially heinous, not just theft, but sacrilege, a violation of the eternal rest of the dead. Those caught faced torture and execution. Their confessions, extracted under duress, were recorded in detail, and some of these records survive. Eerie testimonies from voices that should have been silent millennia ago. Meanwhile, in the lands that would become Greece, early forms of law were emerging from tribal customs. The Greeks would eventually develop legal thinking in directions no one had imagined, but in the beginning, their laws were simpler, tied to kinship and honor, to the demands of family and clan. The earliest Greek laws we know of come from the 7th century before the Common Era, written down by men whose names still echo: Draco, Solon. These were not kings or priests, but citizens, chosen or self-appointed, tasked with bringing order to societies that were tearing themselves apart with blood feuds and class warfare. Draco's laws for Athens were famously severe, so harsh that we still use his name when we speak of draconian measures. The penalty for nearly every crime was death, whether you stole a cabbage or committed murder. When asked why, Draco supposedly said that small crimes deserved death, and he could think of no higher penalty for great ones. But even this harshness served a purpose. Before Draco, justice had been arbitrary, controlled by aristocratic families who interpreted unwritten customs to their own advantage. By writing the laws down, even terrible laws, Draco made them public, knowable, the same for everyone. A farmer could not be surprised by a noble claiming some ancient privilege no one else had heard of. Solon came later, brought in to reform Athens when the city was on the brink of civil war. The poor were enslaved by debt to the rich. The rich feared uprising. Everyone was angry. Solon canceled the debts, freed those enslaved, and rewrote the laws to be less severe, more balanced. He created a system where citizens could bring cases, where juries would decide, where power was, if not equally distributed, at least more widely shared. His reforms did not satisfy everyone. The rich thought he went too far, the poor not far enough, but he created something that would grow over generations into the Athenian democracy with its popular courts and citizen juries, its assumption that free men, however poor, had a right to participate in justice. The Greeks developed something else, something subtle but revolutionary, the idea that laws should be rational, that they should make sense, that you could debate them, question them, change them if better arguments prevailed. This was different from receiving laws from a god or a king. This was law as human creation, imperfect, improvable, alive. In the Greek city-states, law became a subject of philosophy. Plato wondered what justice truly was, not just what the laws said, but what the underlying reality might be. Aristotle categorized different forms of government, different legal systems, analyzing them like natural phenomena, trying to understand what made some cities thrive and others fail. The Romans, who would eventually conquer the Greek world and much else besides, began with laws as simple as any other people's, tribal, customary, passed down through generations of patrician families who guarded their interpretation jealously. For centuries, the law was whatever the aristocrats said it was, and the common people had no way to check or challenge them. But in the 5th century, before the Common Era, after a struggle between the classes, the Romans did something remarkable. They sent a delegation to Greece to study the laws of other cities. And when these men returned, they helped create the 12 Tables, Rome's first written legal code, displayed in the forum where anyone could read them. The 12 Tables were not sophisticated, not by the standards of later Roman law. They were blunt, practical, concerned with property and procedure and the basic mechanics of living together, but they were public, visible, knowable. A plebeian farmer could walk into the forum and read the same laws that bound a patrician senator. The tables covered debts and inheritance, the proper way to summon someone to court, the punishment for breaking someone's bone versus merely bruising them, the rules for burial, for cutting trees that overhung a neighbor's property, for the shared use of roads, every detail of daily friction and cooperation set down in bronze for all to see. One law stated that if a father sold his son into slavery 3 times, the son would be free from paternal authority. It tells us something disturbing about the power fathers held, but also about limits, about a society recognizing that even traditional authority could be abused, could go too far. The Romans had a genius for law, a patience for detail and categorization that would eventually produce the most influential legal system the Western world has ever known. But this development took centuries, unfolding so slowly that no one living through it could have perceived the magnitude of what was being built. Roman law grew through the interpretations of jurists, learned men who studied the old laws and the new situations that arose in an expanding empire. These jurists were not judges, not legislators, but scholars, advisors, men whose opinions on legal questions carried such weight that their writings became law themselves in practice. They developed the concept of legal personhood, the idea that an entity could have rights and duties separate from the individual people within it. A corporation, a municipality, a temple could own property, make contracts, sue and be sued. This abstraction, this legal fiction, opened possibilities that would shape commerce and governance for millennia. The Romans distinguished between different types of law: jus civile, the law that applied to Roman citizens, and jus gentium, the law of nations, principles common to all peoples. This latter category emerged from Rome's interactions with countless foreign traders and subject peoples, a recognition that some legal concepts seemed universal: property, contract, injury. These existed in every culture Rome encountered. As the Roman Empire expanded, swallowing territories from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara, the practical challenges of governance demanded legal innovation. How do you rule an empire of 50 million people, speaking dozens of languages, following hundreds of local customs, without drowning in chaos? The answer, developed over generations, was a combination of flexibility and uniformity. Local laws continued for local matters, but certain principles, certain procedures were Roman, standardized, predictable. A merchant in Alexandria could make a contract with a merchant in Gaul, confident that both understood the basic framework, the essential terms. Roman courts became famous, or perhaps infamous, for their formalism, their insistence on precise procedures. Speak the wrong formula, make your claim in the wrong words, and your case would fail no matter how just. This could be maddening, but it also created predictability. If you knew the forms, followed the procedures, you knew what would happen. Rich or poor, citizen or foreigner, the mechanism worked the same way. The praetors, magistrates who presided over courts, published annual edicts listing the circumstances under which they would grant remedies. Over time, these edicts became longer, more detailed, incorporating successful innovations from previous years, building layer upon layer of legal doctrine like sedimentary rock. By the time of the Emperor Justinian, in the 6th century of the Common Era, Roman law had become vast, unwieldy, scattered across centuries of edicts and juristic writings and imperial constitutions. Justinian, ruling from Constantinople over what remained of the empire, commissioned a massive compilation and rationalization of this legal heritage. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, The body of civil law, a work so comprehensive, so carefully organized, that it would become the foundation for legal systems across Europe and beyond when it was rediscovered centuries later. It contained the digest, 50 books summarizing the writings of the great jurists, the institutes, a textbook for law students, the code, organizing imperial legislation, and the novels, new laws Justinian himself had issued. This was not merely preservation, it was creative. The compilers selected, edited, harmonized, sometimes altered the old texts to make them consistent, to remove contradictions, to reflect current needs. They were building something that would outlast their empire, though they could not have known it. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, legal traditions equally sophisticated were developing along entirely different lines. In China, Confucian philosophy shaped legal thinking in ways alien to Roman minds. The Confucian ideal emphasized harmony, proper relationships, social hierarchy, moral education. Law was seen as necessary but inferior to moral persuasion, to the cultivation of virtue. Chinese legal codes were detailed and comprehensive, covering criminal matters extensively, but civil disputes, conflicts over property or contracts, were often handled through mediation, through appeals to shame and propriety, through family and community pressure. The goal was not individual rights, but social harmony, not adversarial justice, but the restoration of proper order. The Tang Code, completed in the 7th century of the Common Era, stands as one of the great achievements of Chinese legal thought. 500 articles, clearly organized, with extensive commentary explaining the reasoning behind each provision. It covered everything from treason to tax collection, from family relations to military discipline. Punishments were graded by severity, from light beating with a bamboo stick to death, with many gradations in between. The number of blows, the weight of the stick, the type of labor, the duration of exile, all precisely specified, and the punishment varied based on the relationship between offender and victim. Harming a superior was worse than harming an equal. Harming a parent worse than harming a stranger. This was collective responsibility made legal. If one person committed a serious crime, relatives might also be punished, exiled, enslaved. The individual was not the primary unit. The family was the clan, the community. Law served to maintain these nested hierarchies, these webs of obligation and authority. In India, legal traditions drew from religious texts, the Dharma Shastras, which outlined proper conduct for people of different castes, different stages of life, different circumstances. These were not law codes in the Western sense, not enacted by rulers, but texts of learning, studied, debated, applied by scholars and judges who understood their complexities. The most famous, the Laws of Manu, dating from sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era, covers an enormous range of topics: ritual purity, marriage, inheritance, contracts, crime, kingship. It sees law as part of dharma, cosmic order, religious duty, social obligation, all woven together inseparably. Justice in this system was intensely personal, particularized. What was right for a Brahmin might be wrong for a merchant. What was appropriate for a young man might be inappropriate for an elder. The law did not pretend to treat everyone the same. It explicitly recognized and reinforced social distinctions, building them into every judgment. In the Islamic world, law developed from the Quran and the example of the Prophet Muhammad, his sayings and actions preserved in hadith. From these sources, scholars derived principles and rules through analogical reasoning, through consensus, through the careful work of interpretation that would occupy the finest legal minds for centuries. Islamic law, Sharia, governed not just crime and contract, but prayer and diet, marriage and divorce, charity and inheritance. It was comprehensive, touching every aspect of a life, binding the believer in a web of obligation to God and community. The scholars, the ulama, devoted their lives to understanding this law, to elaborating its details, to applying it to new situations the Prophet could never have encountered. Different schools of interpretation emerged, each with slightly different methodologies, different emphases, but all recognized as legitimate. A Muslim merchant might follow one school, while his business partner followed another, and both would be considered right in their different ways. This plurality within unity, this recognition of legitimate disagreement, was itself a kind of legal principle. The Islamic courts, presided over by judges called qadis, handled disputes according to these scholarly interpretations. The qadi listened to witnesses, consulted legal texts, issued rulings that were binding but also subject to appeal to higher authorities. Justice was meant to be accessible. A poor person could bring a complaint against a rich one, a woman against a man, though the weight given to testimony varied by the witness's status and gender. In medieval Europe, as the Roman Empire in the West crumbled and reformed into smaller kingdoms, law became fragmented, localized. Each region, each manor, each town had its own customs, often unwritten, passed down through memory and practice. A person might live under several overlapping legal systems at once: the law of their lord, the law of the church, the law of their guild or town. The Catholic Church developed its own legal system, canon law, governing the clergy and matters the Church claimed jurisdiction over: marriage, wills, contracts made under oath, heresy. This law was written, studied at universities, administered by church courts that existed parallel to secular ones. A person might be tried in both for the same act, under different legal theories. The rediscovery of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis in 11th century Italy sparked something extraordinary, a revival of legal study that would transform Europe. The texts were found in libraries, copied, studied, debated in the new universities that were just beginning to form: Bologna, Paris, Oxford, places where young men gathered to learn law as a scholarly discipline, not just a craft. These medieval law students, sitting on hard benches in cold stone rooms, wrestled with Roman concepts that seemed both alien and compelling. The idea that law could be systematic, rational, that it could be studied with the same rigor as theology or philosophy. This was intoxicating. It suggested that human society could be ordered, understood, improved through the application of reason. The scholars who taught Roman law, the glossators and commentators, did not simply preserve the ancient texts. They adapted them, expanded them, applied them to medieval situations the Romans never imagined. What did Roman contract law say about feudal obligations, about guild regulations, about the rights of a town against its bishop? This scholastic method of close reading and logical analysis, of harmonizing conflicting authorities through careful interpretation, shaped legal thinking across Europe. It created a common vocabulary, a shared framework, even as each kingdom maintained its own particular laws and customs. England developed differently. The Norman conquest in 1066 brought a new ruling class, French-speaking, with continental ideas about governance and law. But English law remained stubbornly distinct, evolving its own peculiar genius through the royal courts that began to displace local and feudal jurisdictions. The common law, as it came to be called, was not written in systematic codes. It emerged from the decisions of royal judges traveling on circuit through the countryside, hearing cases, making rulings that other judges would follow in similar situations. This principle, precedent, became central. A decision made decades ago by a respected judge carried weight, guided current cases, built up over time into an unwritten body of law known through memory and practice. English juries began as groups of local men who knew the facts of a case, who could tell the judge what had happened. But gradually they transformed into something else, into judges of fact, listening to evidence presented by others, deliberating, deciding. This peculiar institution, ordinary people determining guilt or innocence, would spread wherever English influence reached. The great English judges became almost legendary figures. Bracton, Coke, Blackstone, men who wrote treatises attempting to explain and systematize the common law, to make visible the principles underlying thousands of individual decisions. They saw themselves as discovering law, not making it, uncovering ancient liberties and rights that had always existed, waiting to be articulated. This fiction, that law was immemorial custom rather than human creation, served important purposes. It made law seem natural, inevitable, beyond the whim of kings. When English lawyers resisted royal power, they did so by claiming to defend ancient rights, liberties supposedly guaranteed since time immemorial, whether or not such antiquity was historically accurate. The Magna Carta, sealed in 1215, began as a practical peace treaty between a king and his rebellious barons. Most of its provisions dealt with feudal minutiae, fishing rights, forest law, widows' inheritance, but it contained phrases that would echo through centuries. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. These words would be read and reread, interpreted and reinterpreted by later generations seeking to limit royal power, to establish rights against authority. The document itself, reissued, amended, became a symbol of something larger than its actual text, a touchstone for the idea that even kings were bound by law. On the European continent, the Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical learning, including Roman law, but it also brought growing centralization, the rise of absolute monarchies that claimed power over fractured feudal arrangements. Law became an instrument of state building, of creating unified kingdoms from patchwork territories. France under Louis XIV exemplified this. The Sun King's power seemed absolute, his word law, yet even he governed through elaborate legal structures, ordinances covering everything from commerce to criminal procedure. The great jurist Colbert organized and rationalized French law, making it more uniform, more predictable, more efficient as a tool of royal administration. The Enlightenment of the 18th century brought new questions, new challenges to legal traditions. Philosophers asked why laws existed, what justified punishment, whether inherited legal systems served justice or merely preserved privilege. Montesquieu analyzed the relationship between laws and climate, culture, political systems, seeking patterns, underlying principles. Cesare Beccaria's treatise on crimes and punishments, published in 1764, attacked the cruelty and arbitrariness of criminal justice, arguing for proportionate punishments, for the abolition of torture, for the idea that the purpose of criminal law was not vengeance but the prevention of future crimes. His ideas spread rapidly, influencing legal reforms across Europe and beyond. The American and French revolutions brought Enlightenment ideals into collision with reality. The Americans, declaring independence in 1776, claimed that all men were created equal, endowed with unalienable rights. They built a constitution that divided power, that created checks and balances, that subjected even the highest authority to written law. This written constitution, while supreme over ordinary legislation, was something new. The idea that judges could strike down laws as unconstitutional, that courts could protect rights against democratic majorities, developed gradually, famously articulated by Chief Justice Marshall in Marbury versus Madison in 1803. It made law, or at least constitutional law, a kind of secular scripture, fundamental, difficult to change, binding on all. The French Revolution went further, or tried to, sweeping away feudal privileges, noble courts, ecclesiastical jurisdiction. The revolutionaries attempted to rationalize French law completely, to build from first principles a legal system based on reason and equality. The result, after years of turmoil, was the Napoleonic Code of 1804. Napoleon's civil code was clear, accessible, organized logically rather than historically. It covered persons, property, and the acquisition of property through inheritance and contract. It proclaimed equality before the law, the supremacy of the state over the church in civil matters, the rights of property owners. It was not democratic, not in a modern sense, but it was rational, knowable, the same for everyone of the same status. This code spread wherever French armies marched and remained even after they retreated. It influenced legal systems across Europe, Latin America, parts of Asia and Africa, becoming one of the foundation stones of the civil law tradition that still governs most of the world outside the English-speaking countries. The 19th century saw law professionalizing, systematizing, becoming more technical and specialized. Law schools multiplied, training lawyers in doctrine and procedure. Legal scholarship became more rigorous, more self-consciously scientific, seeking to derive principles, to eliminate contradictions, to make law coherent and complete. In Germany, legal scholars developed the Pandectist school, attempting to derive from Roman law a comprehensive, logically perfect legal system. Their work influenced the German Civil Code of 1896, a monument to systematic legal thought. Every concept carefully defined, every relationship between concepts precisely articulated. It was law as architecture, as mathematics, beautiful in its structure, even when difficult in its application. The British Empire spread the common law across a quarter of the globe. adapting it to vastly different societies, India, Australia, Canada, parts of Africa. Local customs persisted. Hybrid systems emerged, but the basic structures, precedent, juries, adversarial procedure, the emphasis on rights and remedies rather than codes, these traveled with colonial administrators and judges. This legal colonialism had complex effects. It displaced indigenous legal systems, imposed foreign concepts of property and contract, disrupted traditional authorities and dispute resolution mechanisms, yet it also sometimes provided tools for challenging colonial power itself. Lawyers educated in London could use English legal principles, English ideas about rights and due process, to argue against the injustices of colonial rule. The 20th century brought challenges to law unprecedented in scope and horror. Total wars, genocides, totalitarian regimes that used legal forms to accomplish monstrous ends. The Nazi regime, for instance, maintained courts and enacted laws, but perverted them so completely that law became an instrument of systematic murder. This raised questions that still haunt legal philosophy. Can anything count as law, or are there acts so evil they fall outside law's boundaries? The response after World War II was the development of international human rights law, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the Geneva Conventions, the European Convention on Human Rights. These attempted to establish legal principles transcending national borders, protecting individuals even against their own governments. The Nuremberg trials introduced the concept of crimes against humanity, acts so heinous they violated not just national law, but universal moral principles. The tribunal's legitimacy was contested. Victor's justice, ex post facto law, but it established a precedent. The idea that individuals could be held legally accountable for state-sponsored atrocities. Legal systems diversified and specialized throughout the 20th century. Environmental law, consumer protection, securities regulation, intellectual property in the digital age. Each area developed its own technical vocabulary, its own body of precedent or statute, its own community of expert practitioners. Law became less a unified field than a collection of related disciplines. The story of law, when you step back far enough to see its full arc, is really a story about trust, about the slow, patient construction of systems that allow strangers to live together, to trade, to resolve conflicts without violence. It is one of humanity's quiet miracles, easy to overlook because it surrounds us like air. Consider what it means that you can walk into a shop, hand over pieces of paper, or tap a card and receive goods in return. The entire transaction rests on layers of law, contract law, property law, commercial law, currency regulations, consumer protections, none of it visible, but all of it necessary. Without these invisible structures, the simple exchange would be impossible, or at least fraught with danger and suspicion. The evolution from personal vengeance to impersonal justice took millennia, required countless innovations, countless failures. In the beginning, if someone harmed you, you or your family had to seek redress. Blood feuds could span generations, destroying communities. Law, even harsh law, offered an alternative, a way to satisfy the demand for justice without endless cycles of revenge. Writing was crucial, transformative. When law existed only in memory, it could be manipulated, forgotten, reinterpreted by those with power, but carved in stone, pressed in clay, written on papyrus or parchment or paper. Law became something you could point to, could study, could hold authorities accountable to. The act of writing created a kind of legal time, a past that could be consulted, compared with the present, used to shape the future. The idea that law should be rational, explicable, defensible through argument rather than mere authority emerged slowly, unevenly, across different cultures. But wherever it took root, it changed the nature of power. A ruler who had to justify decisions by reference to law, to precedent, to principle, was constrained in ways a pure autocrat was not. Even if the constraint was sometimes more theoretical than real, the theory mattered. It created a standard, a possibility of resistance. Legal systems develop different answers to fundamental questions. Is law discovered or created? Does it come from God, from nature, from human agreement? Is it its purpose? Order, justice, liberty, the protection of rights, the promotion of virtue? Different civilization, different eras, gave different answers, and their legal structures reflected these deep philosophical commitments. The tension between flexibility and certainty runs through all legal history. Make law too rigid, too bound by ancient precedent or inflexible rules, and it cannot adapt to changing circumstances, cannot do justice in novel situations, but make it too flexible, too dependent on individual judges' discretion, and it becomes unpredictable, arbitrary. People cannot plan their lives, cannot know what will be permitted or punished. Different systems struck this balance differently. The common law privileged flexibility, allowing judges to distinguish cases, to adapt old principles to new facts. The civil law tradition emphasized certainty, comprehensive codes, clear rules. Both worked, both had advantages and costs. Both continue to evolve, to borrow from each other, to seek that elusive equilibrium. What strikes me most, thinking about this long history, is how much of law consists of fictions, useful untruths we all agree to believe. The idea that a corporation is a person, that possession is 9/10 of ownership, that silence can constitute agreement, that a will speaks from the moment of death. These are not descriptions of reality, and they are tools, conceptual instruments that allow us to resolve disputes, to facilitate transactions, to live together in complex societies. The language of law evolved its own strange beauty, its precision and formality, its archaic phrases preserved like insects in amber, witnesseth, hereinafter, whereas this language serves functions. It signals seriousness. It connects present documents to centuries of precedent, but it also excludes, creates barriers, makes law inaccessible to those without training. This tension between professional expertise and democratic accessibility remains unresolved. Courts throughout history have been stages for human drama, strangers meeting to resolve disputes that might otherwise destroy them, witnesses summoning memories, lawyers deploying rhetoric, judges weighing evidence and law and their own conscience. These rituals, formal and often slow, serve to transform raw conflict into something society can manage, can conclude, can move past. The greatest legal achievements, the ones that echo through centuries, often came not from famous trials or celebrated judges, but from patient, unglamorous work, compiling precedents, organizing codes, writing treatises, training students, building institutions that would outlast their founders. Law is cumulative. Each generation inherits and passes on, adding a little, refining a little, occasionally revolutionizing, but mostly building incrementally on what came before. And still, with all this history, all this accumulated wisdom, legal systems remain imperfect, sometimes profoundly unjust. They have been used to enslave, to oppress, to legitimize cruelty. The same institutions that protect can also harm. The same procedures that ensure fairness can also delay justice. The same technicality that prevents abuse can also produce absurdity. Perhaps this is inevitable. Law is a human creation shaped by human limitations, human prejudices, human failures of imagination. But it is also shaped by human aspiration, by the persistent belief that things could be better, fairer, more just. Every legal reform, from the 12 Tables to modern human rights law, represents someone's vision of a better world, implemented imperfectly, but implemented nonetheless. The story continues. Of course, law did not stop evolving in the 20th century. It adapts to new technologies, to global interconnection, to challenges the ancients could never have imagined: climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, cryptocurrency. Each raises legal questions that require new answers, new frameworks, new fictions that allow us to apply old principles to unprecedented situations. And now, at this late hour, with the history of law stretching behind like a vast tapestry, threads of every color woven together over millennia, I find myself thinking not about grand theories or famous cases, but about quiet moments. A scribe in Babylon, carefully pressing wedges into clay, knowing someone would read these words long after he was dust. An English villager on a jury, nervous, uncertain, but doing his best to determine truth. A law student in medieval Bologna, reading by candlelight, wrestling with concepts that had survived 1,000 years and would survive 1,000 more. These were ordinary people, doing ordinary work, but their accumulated efforts created something extraordinary, a world where strangers can trust each other enough to build cities, where the weak have some protection against the strong, where disputes can be resolved without blood, where we can imagine, however imperfectly we achieve it, something called justice. The laws themselves, in their thousands and thousands, in their codes and precedents and commentaries, are less important than what they represent. The belief that society need not be chaos, that right and wrong exist, that fairness is possible, that we can do better than might makes right. Every legal system, however flawed, embodies this faith, this hope. Outside, somewhere, the world continues. So people make agreements, break them, seek remedies. Courts open, hear cases, close. Legislatures debate, enact, repeal. Lawyers argue, judges decide. Prisoners wait in cells built by law. Property changes hands under law's protection. Children are born into legal relationships. Parents, citizens, inheritors, all of it so ordinary we barely notice. But beneath the ordinary, beneath the forms and procedures and technical vocabulary, runs something older, something that connects us to those first humans who decided together what was permitted and what was forbidden, who chose community over chaos, who built, however ever roughly, the first foundations of justice. The story of law is the story of civilization itself, of our long, slow, stumbling attempt to create order without tyranny, justice without vengeance, liberty within limits. It is unfinished. It will always be unfinished. Each generation must take up the work anew, must adapt old principles to new challenges, must defend what is worth preserving and change what is not. But for now, in this quiet moment of reflection, it is enough to have traced the thread, to have followed it from ancient Mesopotamia to the present day, to have seen how much we have built, how far we have come, how much wisdom, how much folly, how much hope embedded in these systems we call law. The words themselves begin to blur, to drift, like smoke from an ancient fire, like voices fading across centuries. The great codes and constitution, the famous trials and celebrated judges, all of it receding gently into history, into the vast archive of human striving, and what remains as the light grows softer, as thought grows quieter, is simply this: the recognition that law, for all its imperfections, represents something beautiful, our collective agreement to be bound by something larger than ourselves, our commitment to reason over force, to procedure over caprice, to the possibility, however distant, of justice. The thread runs back through time and forward into futures we cannot see, connecting us all, ancient scribe and modern lawyer, plaintiff and defendant, lawmaker and law-abiding, all of us caught in this web of rules and rights and remedies, this vast human construction we call legal order, so ordinary, so miraculous, so quietly essential to everything we are. And with that thought, soft as falling snow, the story comes to rest. There is something about the way a cat moves through a room, the way it pauses in a shaft of moonlight, the way it settles into a space as if claiming what has always been its own, that speaks to a story much older than we might imagine. Tonight, I find myself thinking about these creatures, these elegant companions who share our homes and our lives with such quiet authority, and I wonder how it came to be this way, how these independent beings, these hunters and wanderers, came to rest beside our hearths and curl into our laps. The story begins not in the living rooms and kitchens of today, but in a world that seems almost dreamlike in its distance from us, a world of dust and sun and endless golden grain. If I close my eyes, I can almost see it, the landscape of the ancient Near East, some 9,000 or 10,000 years ago, where the great river valleys cradle the first stirrings of what we might call civilization. The Fertile Crescent, they call it, that arc of a land stretching from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia and down along the Mediterranean, where humans first gathered the wild grasses and began to to cultivate them, to transform wandering into settling, and in those settlements, in those first permanent villages built of mud, brick, and stone, something remarkable was happening. Grain was being stored, harvested wheat and barley piled in granaries, creating abundance, creating surplus, creating something that had never existed before in quite this way. But abundance draws more than grateful humans. It draws smaller creatures too, mice and rats who found in these stores of grain a paradise beyond imagining, and the granaries became their kingdoms, their feast halls, unless something else arrived. Imagine those early villages at dusk, the air cooling after the fierce heat of day, smoke rising from cooking fires, the sounds of children and dogs, and the low voices of people settling in for the evening, and there at the edge of the firelight, moving like liquid shadow, a small form, tawny and striped, eyes catching the glow, the wild cat, Felis sylvestris libica, the African wildcat, slipping between the buildings, drawn not by the humans themselves, but by the abundance of prey that the humans had inadvertently created. These cats were hunters, solitary and wary, keeping to themselves in the scrublands and deserts. But here was opportunity. Here was an endless supply of the very creatures they had evolved to catch, and so they came. Generation after generation, not tamed, not domesticated, not yet, but tolerated, the humans who might have chased away other predators, who might have seen them as threats or competitors, instead watched these small hunters with something like appreciation, because the cats were solving a problem, keeping the grain stores safe, protecting the harvest that meant survival. This was not domestication as we might imagine it. No one was reaching out to pet these wild hunters. No one was offering them scraps or inviting them inside. This was something more subtle, a kind of mutual tolerance, a recognition of benefit. The cats hunted. The humans allowed them to hunt. And slowly, so slowly, across hundreds of years, the distance between them began to close. There must have been individual cats, particular animals, who were less fearful than others, whose temperaments were naturally more bold, more curious, who ventured closer to the humans, who perhaps even learned to associate the presence of people with the presence of prey. And these cats, these slightly bolder individuals, they survived, they thrived, they passed their genes on to their kittens. And there must have been individual humans, particular farmers or storekeepers or children, who looked at these small hunters with fascination rather than fear, who began to notice their patterns, their habits, who perhaps left out scraps intentionally, or who simply moved more gently, more quietly, allowing the cats to remain nearby. Generation by generation, grain season after grain season, the relationship shifted, deepened, transformed. The cats who could tolerate human presence had better access to prey. The humans who tolerated cats had cleaner grain stores, and somewhere in that exchange, in that slow dance of mutual benefit, domestication began its quiet work, not through cages or leashes, not through force or capture, but through the simple arithmetic of survival and advantage. The cats were choosing this proximity as much as the humans were choosing to allow it. And in that choice, in that mutual selection, something new was being born into the world, a partnership, however loose and undefined, between two species who each saw in the other not an enemy, not quite a friend, but a useful presence, a beneficial neighbor in the long work of a living. And so the stage was set in those ancient villages, under those ancient stars, for a relationship that would span millennia, that would cross continents, that would transform both species in ways neither could have anticipated, as the wild hunters began their slow, almost imperceptible journey toward the windowsills and armchairs of the modern world. The archaeological record, when we learn to read it, speaks in whispers rather than declarations. It offers us fragments, pieces of bone and pottery, burial sites and refuse heaps. And from these remnants we must reconstruct entire worlds. On the island of Cyprus, in a place called Chilourokambos, archaeologists found something remarkable, a grave, dated to approximately 7,500 years before the present. And in that grave, buried with care alongside a human body, was a cat. Not just any arrangement, not the accidental inclusion of remains, but a deliberate placement. The cat had been laid to rest mere inches from the human, in a position that suggests intention, relationship, perhaps even affection. And this discovery tells us something profound, because Cyprus is an island and cats are not native to islands. Someone brought that cat across the water. Someone carried it on a boat, valued it enough to transport it, to keep it, to eventually bury it with ceremony. This was no wild creature wandering through. This was a companion. This was a relationship that had already formed, already deepened, already become something worth preserving even in death. And if cats were being transported to islands 7,500 years ago, then the relationship must have been developing for centuries before that, millennia perhaps, in those grain villages of the Fertile Crescent, in the slow accumulation of trust and proximity, the genetic studies, when scientists began to analyze the DNA of modern house cats and compare it to their wild relatives, painted a picture of origins. They found that all domestic cats, every tabby and calico and Siamese, trace their lineage back to that same source. Felis sylvestris libica, the African wildcat, still prowling the deserts and scrublands of the Middle East and North Africa. But the genetics revealed something else too, something fascinating about the nature of the cat domestication. Unlike dogs, who show dramatic physical differences from their wolf ancestors, cats change very little. The skull shape, the body size, the basic architecture of the feline form remained remarkably stable. What changed was not so much the cat's body, but its behavior, its willingness to be near, its tolerance, its temperament. This tells us that humans were not actively breeding cats for specific traits the way they bred dogs for hunting or herding or guarding. The cats were largely selecting themselves, the ones who could abide human presence, who could adapt to the noise and activity of settlements, who could raise their kittens in the margins of human spaces. Those were the ones who prospered, who multiplied, who passed on their slightly more tolerant, slightly more flexible natures. In the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, in the archaeological layers of sites like Jarmo and Jericho, we find evidence of cats among the ruins, not as rarities but as regular presences. Their bones appear in the refuse, suggesting they were part of the daily fabric of life, hunting the mice and rats, living alongside the humans, not quite wild, not quite tame, existing in that liminal space between two worlds. And then, if we follow the timeline forward, if we trace the spread of agriculture and settlement, we come to Egypt, and here the story transforms, deepens, becomes something richer and stranger. Egypt, with its great river, the Nile, bringing life to the desert, creating a ribbon of fertility where grain could grow in abundance, where granaries could be filled to overflowing, where the need for cats as protectors of food stores became not just useful but essential. Egypt, where cats would become not merely tolerated, not merely useful, but sacred. The ancient Egyptians, in their sophisticated understanding of the world, saw in the cat something divine. The goddess Bastet, originally depicted as a fierce lioness, gradually transformed in the artistic record into a more domestic form, a cat-headed woman, graceful and protective, associated with home and fertility, with music and dance, with joy and protection. Cats in Egypt were not simply animals, they were living representations of divine power. They were protectors not just of grain, but of households, of children, of the domestic sphere itself. And the Egyptians treated them accordingly, with reverence, with care, with laws that protected them from harm. To kill a cat in ancient Egypt, even accidentally, could bring severe punishment, death in some cases. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, recorded his observations of Egyptian cat worship with a mixture of fascination and bewilderment. He described how Egyptians would shave their eyebrows in mourning when a household cat died, how they would carry the body to special burial sites, how they would mummify these creatures with the same care given to human dead, and the mummies themselves, thousands upon thousands of cat mummies, have been discovered in Egypt, small wrapped forms, some containing kittens, some adult cats, preserved for eternity. Many were offerings to Bastet, devotional objects, ways of seeking favor from the goddess, but others, buried in household contexts, seemed to be individual pets, specific animals who were loved and mourned and remembered. The art of ancient Egypt shows us cats everywhere. Tomb paintings depict them sitting beneath chairs, collared and decorated, clearly domesticated, clearly valued. Some images show them on hunting expeditions, trained to retrieve birds, working alongside their human companions in the marshes. Other images show them simply as part of daily life, eating fish, playing, existing in the comfortable spaces of home. One famous image from the tomb of Nebamun, a scribe and official, shows a hunting scene, and there, leaping with impossible grace, is a cat catching birds in mid-flight, its body twisted in that characteristic feline flexibility. This cat wears a collar. This cat is doing work for its human, but the artist has captured something more than mere utility. There is beauty here, admiration, perhaps even affection in the careful rendering of the animal's form. The Egyptians bred cats, selectively choosing for temperament and appearance, creating varieties, color patterns, the spotted tabby, the mackerel tabby. The solid colors all began to appear with more frequency, more definition, and while the cats remained physically similar to their wild ancestors, the behavioral distance grew wider. These were animals who sought human company, who lived entirely within human spaces, who had forgotten or never learned the full wildness of their heritage. And from Egypt, the cats began to spread, not through their own wandering, though cats are certainly capable of that, but through human agency, through trade routes and military campaigns, through the slow expansion of civilizations. Phoenician traders sailing the Mediterranean coup, carrying goods from port to port, brought cats aboard their ships, practical measures against the rats that could ruin cargo, but also, perhaps, companions in the long, lonely stretches of sea travel. And when those ships made port in Greece, in Rome, in the far reaches of the Mediterranean world, some cats went ashore, some cats stayed, and new populations established themselves in new lands. The Romans, ever practical, valued cats for the same reasons the early farmers had: pest control, protection of food stores, but they also, in their way, appreciated them as creatures of comfort. Images from Pompeii, that city frozen in volcanic ash, show cats in domestic contexts, mosaics, depicting them with extraordinary detail and care. These were not wild animals feared or merely tolerated. These were household members. A mosaic from the House of the Faun in Pompeii shows a cat catching a bird, the scene rendered with such skill that we can almost see the tension in the cat's muscles, the focus in its eyes, the moment of the hunt, captured forever in tiny tiles of colored stone. Someone commissioned this. Someone wanted this image in their home, wanted to see that feline grace and power every day. In Greece, cats appear in the artistic records somewhat later than in Egypt. But when they do appear, they are shown with similar familiarity, similar integration into daily life. Vase paintings, sculptures, literary references all suggest that by the classical period, cats had become unremarkable in their presence, common enough to need no explanation, simply part of the texture of civilized life. But the spread was not uniform, was not simple. In some places, cats arrived early, in others much later. The island of Britain, for instance, seems to have received its first domestic cats during the Roman occupation, sometime in the first few centuries of the Common Era. Before that, the people of Britain had no cats, relied on other methods, other animals, or simply accepted losses to rodents as inevitable. And in each new place, each new climate and culture, the cats adapted, interbred sometimes with local wild cat populations where they existed, creating new genetic mixtures, new patterns, but always maintaining that core identity, that essential catness that had first drawn humans to tolerate their presence in the granaries of the Fertile Crescent. The behavioral relationship, that delicate balance of independence and affection that characterizes the house cat, was already established by this early period. Cats were not pack animals like dogs, did not form hierarchical relationships with humans as leaders or alphas. Instead, they remained fundamentally solitary in their social structure, willing to coexist, willing to accept food and shelter, willing even to show affection, but always on their own terms, always retaining that core of self-determination. This must have been part of their appeal, this combination of beauty and utility, of warmth and wildness. They could be companions without being servile, could be useful without being dependent, could share a home while remaining somehow apart, mysterious, other. The ancient writers, when they mentioned cats, often noted this quality, this sense of the cat as a creature that chooses to stay rather than being compelled to serve. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century, described cats as loving their homes more than their humans, an observation that anyone who has owned a cat might recognize. That sense that the cat has decided to grace you with its presence, has chosen this arrangement and might unchoose it at any moment. And yet, despite this independence, despite this retention of wildness, the bond was real. The evidence of mourning, of deliberate burial, of artistic celebration, all suggest that humans had come to love these creatures, not just value them, not just use them, but genuinely care for them as individuals, as personalities, as beings worthy of affection and memory. By the time the first millennium of the Common Era was well underway, cats had spread throughout the Mediterranean world, into Europe, into Asia, along the trade routes. Each migration carried with it not just the physical animal, but the complex relationship that had been developing for thousands of years, the understanding that cats could be both wild and domestic, both useful and companionable, both independent and affectionate, The foundation had been laid in those ancient grain stores, in those Egyptian temples, in those Roman households, for a relationship that would continue to evolve, to deepen, to spread, until cats would become one of the most successful domesticated species on Earth, living on every continent in nearly every human settlement, always choosing, to remain the medieval world, that 1,000-year span stretching from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance, was a complicated time for cats, a time when the relationship that had been building for millennia would be tested, twisted, darkened, and yet somehow endure. In the monasteries of Europe, those islands of learning and literacy in a largely illiterate world, cats were valued, welcomed even. The monks who spent their days copying manuscripts, preserving knowledge in careful script on vellum pages, understood the threat that mice posed to their precious books. A single mouse could destroy months of painstaking work, could gnaw through irreplaceable texts. And so cats walked the cloisters, slept in the scriptoriums where we were fed and sheltered and appreciated. There exists a manuscript from the 9th century, an Irish text, where a monk has written a small poem in the margin, a brief verse about his cat. Pangur ban, white pangur. The monk compares his own work of hunting for meaning in texts to the cat's work of hunting mice. Each of us, he writes, has his own art, and the verse is tender, affectionate, the words of someone who sees the cat not as mere tool, but as companion, as fellow worker in the quiet hours. But beyond the monastery walls, the relationship was becoming more fraught, more complex. The Christian church in medieval Europe had an ambivalent relationship with animals in general, and cats, with their nocturnal habits, their independence, their inscrutable expressions, began to attract suspicion. Cats were associated with women, with the domestic sphere, with a certain kind of knowledge that existed outside official channels. The village wise woman, the healer who knew herbs and simples, often kept cats. And as the church began to see witchcraft everywhere, as paranoia about heresy and devil worship grew, cats became entangled in those fears. The black cat especially, with its dark fur seeming to absorb light, became a symbol of evil in some quarters, associated with witches and demons, with the devil himself. It was said that witches could transform into cats, that Satan appeared as a black cat, that cats were familiars, demonic servants given to those who had made pacts with dark powers, and so began a period of persecution in some parts of Europe, particularly during the height of witch-hunting hysteria from the 13th to the 17th centuries. Cats were killed in large numbers, thrown from towers, burned in bonfires, tortured as proxies for their supposed witch companions. Whole populations were decimated. The consequences of this mass killing were grimly ironic. With fewer cats to control rodent populations, rats multiplied, thrived, spread, and rats carried fleas, and fleas carried plague. The Black Death that swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing perhaps a third of the population, was spread by rats, by the very creatures that cats had been controlling for thousands of years. Some historians suggest that the persecution of cats contributed to the severity of the plague, that the loss of natural predators allowed rat populations to explode, created conditions where disease could spread more easily. Whether this is true or not, the correlation is striking, haunting, a reminder that the systems we disturb, the relationships we break, often have consequences we cannot foresee. But even during this dark period, even as some cats were being killed out of superstition and fear, others were living quiet lives in barns and kitchens, hunting mice, bearing kittens, carrying on the ancient compact. The persecution was real, but not universal, not constant. Many people, perhaps most people, still valued their cats, still understood their usefulness, still felt affection for these small hunters who asked so little and gave so much, and on ships, cats remained indispensable. Every vessel that put to sea, every merchant ship and naval frigate and exploration vessel carried cats to control the rats that inevitably infested the holds. Sailors were notoriously superstitious, but their superstitions about cats were generally positive. A ship's cat was good luck, protective, essential, and these seafaring cats, traveling in the hulls of ships from Bristol to Bombay, from Lisbon to the New World, spread feline populations to every corner of the globe. When European ships reached the Americas, cats went with them, establishing populations in places that had never known them. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no domestic cats, had developed their own relationships with other animals. But cats, arriving with the colonizers, adapted quickly, found new prey, new climates, new niches to fill. In the Islamic world, the relationship with cats had remained largely positive throughout the medieval period. The Prophet Muhammad, according to tradition, loved cats. One famous story tells of how he cut off the sleeve of his robe rather than disturb his cat Muezza, who was sleeping on it. Another tells of a cat who saved the Prophet from a poisonous snake and was blessed with the ability to always land on its feet. This cultural appreciation meant that in the Islamic world, from Morocco to Indonesia, cats were welcomed in mosques and homes, were fed and cared for, were seen as clean animals, ritually pure, suitable for the company of the faithful. Cities in the Middle East and North Africa developed large populations of free-roaming cats, fed by the community, living in the streets and alleyways, neither fully wild nor fully owned, existing in that characteristic feline space between worlds. In Asia, cats had arrived along the trade routes, the Silk Road bringing not just spices and silk, but animals and ideas. In China, cats appear in the historical record from around 2,000 years ago, valued for pest control in the granaries and silk stores. In Japan, cats arrived from China and Korea, and by the medieval period, the Heian period, they were being kept by the aristocracy, pampered and decorated, subjects of art and poetry. Japanese cats were often kept indoors, especially valuable breeding females, protected and prized. And the Japanese artistic tradition, with its attention to natural detail, its love of asymmetry and imperfection, found endless inspiration in feline forms. Cats appear in scrolls and screens, in woodblock prints, sometimes realistic, sometimes fantastical, transformed into supernatural beings, bakaneko, cats with magical powers. But even these supernatural cats were not necessarily evil. They were complex, tricksters, shapeshifters, reflecting the real cat's ability to seem domesticated one moment and utterly wild the next. The working relationship, cats as controllers of vermin, remained central throughout all of this. In the granaries of medieval Europe and Asia, in the warehouses of port cities, in the holds of ships, in the storage rooms of great houses, cats did the work they had been doing for thousands of years, hunting, killing, protecting human food stores from the creatures that would consume them, but they also increasingly served another function, one that had always been there but was becoming more pronounced, more acknowledged. They provided comfort, companionship, the pleasure of their presence, the softness of fur underhand, the rumbling vibration of purring, the grace of their movements, the mystery of their moods. All of this became valued not for utility, but for its own sake. Wealthy households, those who could afford to feed animals who did no work, began to keep cats purely as pets. Breeding programs, informal at first, began to select for certain traits, certain colors, certain temperaments. The cats of Siam, now Thailand, developed distinctive pointed coloration and blue eyes. The cats of Persia developed long flowing coats. The cats of the Isle of Man developed a genetic mutation that shortened or eliminated their tails. These breeds were not yet standardized, not yet formalized into the rigid categories that would come later, but the diversity was increasing. The appearance of cats was changing through human selection for the first time since domestication began. And this suggested a shift in the relationship. Cats were no longer just tolerated hunters, just useful workers. They were becoming aesthetic objects, status symbols, companions chosen for their beauty as much as their utility. Yet even as breeding began, even as some cats lived lives of luxury in noble households, the vast majority of cats remained working animals, living semi-feral lives in barns and alleys, breeding freely, maintaining the genetic diversity and vigor that would serve the species well. These cats, the common cats, the mixed-breed mousers, were the true inheritors of the ancient compact, still hunting, still choosing to live near humans for the abundance it provided, still raising their kittens in the margins of human civilization. The folklore and superstition surrounding cats grew richer and stranger during this period. In Celtic land, cats were associated with the fairy realm, the other world, mysterious, magical, not quite to be trusted. In Slavic countries, certain markings were thought to bring luck or ward off evil. In Scandinavia, the goddess Freya was said to ride in a chariot pulled by cats, massive cats, powerful enough to draw a divine being. These stories, these beliefs, reflected the cat's liminal nature, the way it existed between wild and tame, between useful and ornamental, between mundane and mysterious. A cat sleeping by the fire was as familiar as bread, but a cat's eyes glowing in darkness, a cat's eerie yowl in the night. These were things that spoke to older fears, older knowings, reminded humans that this creature, however domesticated it seemed, retained something of the wild, the medieval agricultural calendar, the rhythm of seasons and harvests, structured the cat's role. In summer, when grain was harvested and stored, cats were essential, their population allowed to expand to meet the need. In winter, when food was scarce for everyone, fewer cats survived. Natural selection culling the populations. Those who were particularly good hunters, particularly bold in scrounging, particularly favored by humans who would share scraps, those were the ones who made it through to spring. This yearly cycle, repeated across centuries, shaped the cat population, kept them adapted to their role, prevented them from becoming too domesticated, too dependent. They needed to be able to hunt, to survive on their own if necessary, because winter did not care about human sentiment, only about survival. And yet, even in this harsh world, even in times of scarcity and superstition, the bond persisted. People named their cats, mourned them when they died, told stories about particular animals with particular personalities. The historical record, sparse as it is for the lives of common people, still contains glimpses of this affection, wills that mention cats, court records of disputes over cat ownership, small markers of lives lived together. The medieval world was transforming, slowly, imperceptibly from within, moving towards something new, and cats, adapting as they had always adapted, were moving with it, their populations spreading, their genetics diversifying, their relationship with humans deepening in some ways and remaining anciently constant in others, neither fully wild nor fully tame, neither servant nor master, simply present, simply there, sharing the human world while remaining fundamentally themselves. The Renaissance, that flowering of art and learning and rediscovery, brought with it a new way of seeing the world, a new curiosity about natural things. Artists began to observe cats with the same attention they gave to human anatomy, to the play of light on fabric, to the perfect rendering of reality. Leonardo da Vinci filled pages of his notebooks with cat sketches, quick studies of cats stretching, playing, fighting, sleeping. His hand captured the essential catness of these creatures, the way their spines curved, the alertness in their ears, the relaxed power in their limbs. He was not just drawing cats. He was studying them, trying to understand the mechanics of their movement, the architecture of their grace. And in paintings of the period, cats began to appear with increasing frequency, sometimes symbolically, representing domesticity or independence or mystery, but often simply as part of the scene, part of the texture of daily life. A cat in the corner of a domestic interior, a cat sleeping on a windowsill in a portrait. These were not statements about cats, but acknowledgments of their presence, their ordinariness, their integration into human spaces. The printing press, invented in the 15th century, allowed for the spread of knowledge in ways previously unimaginable. Books about natural history began to appear, catalogs of animals, descriptions of their habits and natures, and cats were included, discussed, categorized. Though the understanding was often mixed with folklore and error, still it represented an attempt to know them, to understand them through observation rather than superstition. The age of exploration, those centuries when European ships crossed every ocean, mapped every coast, brought cats to every corner of the globe, Australia, New Zealand, remote islands in the Pacific and Atlantic, all received populations of cats, sometimes deliberately introduced, sometimes escaping from ships, sometimes left behind when ships departed. In these new environments where cats often thrived, especially on islands where native species had evolved without mammalian predators, the ecological impact was sometimes catastrophic. Bird populations decimated, small mammals driven to extinction. The cat's hunting prowess, so valued in granaries and ships, became a destructive force when unleashed on ecosystems that had no evolutionary experience of such predators. This tension between the cat as useful companion and the cat as invasive predator would become increasingly apparent in later centuries. But in the age of exploration itself, the primary concern was practical. Ships needed cats, colonies needed cats, and cats, adaptable as ever, made themselves at home in climates from tropical to Arctic, in landscapes from desert to rainforest. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and classification, brought new attention to the diversity of cat breeds. Scientists like Carolus Linnaeus, who created the system of taxonomic classification still used today, gave the domestic cat its scientific name, Felis catus, distinguishing it from its wild relatives while acknowledging their kinship. And breeders, particularly in England, began to take a more systematic approach to creating distinct varieties. The concept of a breed, as we understand it today, a group of animals with standardized appearance and documented lineage, was developing, first with horses and dogs, but increasingly with cats as well. The Victorian era, that age of empire and industry and domestic refinement, transformed the human relationship with cats in profound ways. Queen Victoria herself kept cats, and what the Queen did, society followed. Cats became fashionable, desirable, objects of refined taste. The first formal cat show was held at the Crystal Palace in London in 1871, organized by Harrison Weir, an artist and cat enthusiast who wanted to elevate the status of cats through competition and standardization. Hundreds of cats were exhibited, judged on their conformity to breed standards, their beauty, their temperament, and thousands of people came to see them, to admire them, to marvel at the variety that could exist within a single species. This was a turning point. Cats were no longer just animals who happened to live with humans. They were becoming projects, subjects of deliberate creation. Their appearance was being shaped through selective breedings more intensively than ever before. Persian cats with their flat faces and flowing coats, Siamese cats with their distinctive points and blue eyes, British short hairs with their round faces and plush fur, Maine Coons with their size and tufted ears. All of these breeds were standardized, refined, promoted. The cat fancy, as it came to be called, spread from England to America and Europe. Cat clubs were formed, breed registries established, rules and standards written and debated. The cats themselves, once they had been street animals, barn animals, workers. Now some of them lived lives of extraordinary privilege, bred for show, pampered and groomed, worth substantial sums of money. But even as this fancy world developed, even as cats became status symbols and show animals, the majority of cats remained what they had always been, mousers and companions, mixed-breed animals living ordinary lives in ordinary homes. The genetic diversity of these common cats, their vigor and adaptability, remained the foundation on which the fancy breeds were built. The 19th century also brought new understanding of cats as biological organisms, the development of a veterinary medicine, the growing scientific study of animal behavior and physiology began to reveal the cat's true nature. They were obligate carnivores, requiring meat in their diet in ways that dogs, more omnivorous, did not. Their digestive systems, their metabolisms, their nutritional needs, all were distinct, specific, requiring understanding if cats were to thrive in captivity. The discovery of the role of cats in disease transmission, particularly toxoplasmosis, brought new concerns. Cats became subjects of public health discussions, their large populations in cities sometimes seen as problems to be managed, yet their value in controlling rats and mice, particularly in warehouses and food storage facilities, remained undeniable. The relationship was being negotiated in new ways, through science and regulation, rather than folklore and tradition. The 20th century, that era of unprecedented change, brought cats fully into the modern world. Urbanization accelerated, and cats adapted. Cities filled with apartment buildings where outdoor space was limited, and cats, unlike dogs, could live contentedly indoors, could use litter boxes, could exercise through play rather than walks. This made them ideal urban pets, perfect companions for the modern working person living in small spaces. Commercial cat food appeared, first in the early 1900s, crude by modern standards but representing a shift. No longer did cats have to hunt or scavenge or rely on table scraps. They could be fed prepared food, formulated, eventually, with their specific nutritional needs in mind. This changed the practical nature of cat keeping, made it easier, more convenient, more accessible to people who lived far from barns and granaries. Veterinary care improved dramatically. Vaccines were developed for common feline diseases. Spaying and neutering became routine, extending cats' lives and preventing unwanted litters. The average lifespan of a pet cat increased from perhaps 5 or 6 years at the beginning of the century to 12 or 15 or even 20 years by its end. This meant deeper bonds, longer relationships, more investment in individual animals. The understanding of cat behavior also deepened. Scientists began to study how cats think, how they communicate, what their social structures look like. Researchers discovered that cats have complex vocalizations, different meows for different purposes, developed specifically to communicate with humans. Their purr, once thought to signal only contentment, was found to also occur during stress or pain, possibly a self-soothing mechanism. Their body language, the position of ears and tail and whiskers, was decoded, catalogued, explained, and people began to understand that cats, while not pack animals, were not the solitary creatures they had been assumed to be. They formed social bonds with humans and with other cats. They could be trained, though their independence meant they were less motivated by pleasing humans than dogs were. They played throughout their lives, retaining kitten-like behaviors into adulthood, a sign of domestication, of neoteny, of perpetual youth. The late 20th century saw an explosion in the cat population of the developed world. In the United States alone, cat ownership surpassed dog ownership. Cats became the most popular pet, their numbers in the tens of millions. Their images filled the early internet, cat videos and photos becoming a defining feature of online culture. The bond between humans and cats, ancient as it was, found new expression in digital sharing, in the celebration of individual cats' personalities and quirks. Yet this population boom brought challenges. Feral cat colonies in cities, abandoned pets breeding freely, creating populations of cats living wild but dependent on human refuse, animal shelters filled with unwanted cats, millions euthanized every year because homes could not be found for them. The same adaptability that had made cats successful, their ability to survive and reproduce in human-altered landscapes, now created problems of overpopulation, and the ecological concerns, first recognized on islands centuries before, became more urgent. Studies showed the devastating impact of free-roaming cats on wildlife, particularly birds and small mammals. Even well-fed pet cats retained their hunting instinct, killed for sport rather than food. The tension between cat lovers and conservationists grew sharp, passionate, unresolved. The relationship had become complicated, layered, no longer the simple compact of the ancient granaries. Cats were beloved companions, family members, sources of comfort and joy. But they were also environmental concerns, public health considerations, subjects of legislation and debate. The intimacy had deepened even as the complications multiplied. And yet, through all of this, the essential nature of the cat remained, still independent, still mysterious, still balancing wildness and domesticity in that characteristic way. A cat sleeping in a sunbeam in a modern apartment, curled on a cushion in a climate-controlled room, fed from a bowl, wearing a collar. That cat retained something of its wild ancestors, something untamed, something that could never be fully possessed or controlled, only invited, only welcomed, only loved on its own terms. The story of domestication, when we really look at it, is not a story of conquest or submission. It is something stranger, more mutual, more mysterious. Think about what happened in those ancient grain stores. Neither species planned it. Neither species understood what was beginning. The cats came for the mice. The humans tolerated the cats. And in that simple exchange, that basic arithmetic of advantage, something profound began to unfold. Because what is domestication, really, if not a kind of dance, a negotiation between two forms of being? The wolf became the dog through transformation, through change so deep that body and mind and behavior were all reshaped. But the cat came to us almost unchanged, slipped into our world while remaining fundamentally itself. This tells us something about the nature of the feline, about that quality of independence that defines them. They domesticated themselves, not through submission but through choice, through a kind of pragmatic opportunism that recognized benefit without surrendering autonomy. And perhaps this is why the bond feels different, why loving a cat is not like loving a dog. A dog gives itself completely, loves with abandon, with devotion, with a kind of wholehearted surrender. But a cat offers something more conditional, more measured, and somehow, in its very conditionality, more precious. When a cat chooses to sit with you, to purr against your hand, to sleep curled in your lap, it is choosing, in that moment, your company over solitude, your warmth over independence. And there is something deeply satisfying in being chosen, in being deemed worthy, in being granted access to that guarded affection. The purr itself, that strange vibration that arises from somewhere deep in the chest, is one of nature's mysteries. Scientists have studied it, measured its frequency, discovered that it falls in a range that may actually promote healing, that may strengthen bones, reduce pain, lower blood pressure. A cat purring on your chest might be offering more than comfort, might be offering something like medicine, ancient and wordless and true. And the eyes, those vertical pupils that expand in darkness, that contract to slits in bright light, giving cats their ability to see in conditions where humans are blind, those eyes that seem to look through you, past you, into some light realm we cannot access. They remind us that this creature, however domesticated, however familiar, perceives the world differently than we do, lives in a sensory landscape we can only imagine. Their hearing, detecting frequencies far above human range, means they exist in a world of sounds we never hear. Their sense of smell, their Jacobson's organ that lets them taste scent, opens dimensions of experience we lack. They are living in our homes, but in a different reality, a parallel world that overlaps with ours, but never quite aligns. And perhaps this is part of the fascination, the enduring mystery. We share our lives with these creatures, and yet can never fully know them, can never fully understand what it is to be them. They remain other, remain wild in some essential way, even as they sleep on our beds and eat from our hands. The scientists who study cat cognition have discovered remarkable things. Cats recognize their names. Though they may choose not to respond, they understand pointing, can follow human gaze, can learn to manipulate humans to get what they want. They are intelligent, but their intelligence is directed toward their own ends, not toward pleasing us, not toward obedience, but toward survival, toward comfort, toward the satisfaction of their own desires. This is not a lesser intelligence, just a different one, shaped by evolution for a solitary hunting lifestyle, for independence rather than cooperation. And when we learn to appreciate it on its own terms, to stop expecting cats to be like dogs, to accept them as they are, the relationship deepens, becomes richer, more real. The bond between cat and human, 10,000 years in the making, is built on this foundation of the mutual benefit and mutual respect. We provide food, shelter, safety, warmth. They provide pest control, companionship, comfort, beauty. But more than that, they provide a connection to something wild, something untamed, something that chose to stay but could choose to leave. In our modern world, so controlled, so domesticated, so cut off from nature, there is something deeply satisfying about living with an animal that bridges that gap, that brings a little wildness into our homes, that reminds us that not everything can be tamed, not everything should be. The cat on the windowsill, watching birds, tail twitching with predatory focus, is the same as the wild cat on the edge of that ancient village, the same hunting instinct, the same fierce concentration. Thousands of years have passed. Civilizations have risen and fallen. The world has transformed beyond recognition, but the cat remains essentially magnificently itself, and in that continuity, that connection to the deep past, there is something profound we are touching when we stroke a cat's fur. The same creature that Egyptian priests revered, that medieval monks sheltered, that sailors carried across uncharted seas, the same and yet always individual, always unique, each cat its own being, its own personality, its own irreplaceable presence. The cats who share our lives today, whether purebred show animals or alley rescues, whether pampered house cats or working barn cats, all carry that ancient heritage. All participate in that long relationship, and they carry it forward into whatever future awaits, adapting as they have always adapted, surviving as they have always survived, choosing us again and again across the generations. This is the gift they offer, not just their practical skills, not just their beauty or their comfort, but their very presence, their embodiment of the wild made familiar, the foreign made close, the independent choosing to stay. They teach us, if we are willing to learn, about boundaries and respect, about patience and acceptance, about loving without possessing, about sharing space without demanding surrender. The relationship is not simple, never has been. It contains darkness, the persecution of the Middle Ages, the ecological damage of invasive populations, the millions of unwanted animals dying in shelters. But it also contains profound beauty, profound connection, profound meaning, and it endures, changes, evolves, but endures. Tonight, thinking about these creatures, about their long journey from the wild edges of human settlements to the centers of our homes and hearts, I find myself filled with a kind of quiet wonder at the strangeness of it, the improbability, the grace that two species so different could find their way to each other, could build something lasting across millennia, could create a bond that neither dominates nor submits, but simply is. This seems almost miraculous, almost beyond explanation. And yet here we are, here they are, cats in houses all over the world, curled in favorite spots, hunting dust motes in shafts of light, purring in laps, living their mysterious cat lives in the intimate proximity of human lives, neither fully wild nor fully tame, neither servant nor master, simply companion, simply present, simply here. The night is deep now, the house is quiet. Somewhere a cat is sleeping, dreaming perhaps of ancient hunts, ancient territories, ancient choices, the same dreams its ancestors dreamed 10,000 years ago, the same essential catness, unchanged, enduring, eternal in its particular way. And in the morning, the cat will wake, will stretch with that perfect feline extension, will walk to its bowl or to the door, will move through its territory with that characteristic grace, will live another day of the long story, the endless story, the story that began in grain stores beside rivers we can barely imagine, and continues here, now, in this moment, in this quiet. The partnership holds 10,000 years and counting. The grain needs protecting, the mice need catching, the hearth needs warming, and the cat, wild and domestic, independent and affectionate, mysterious and familiar, continues its work, continues its presence, continues its choice to stay, to remain, to be with us, but never quite of us, forever itself, forever cat, forever walking that line between two worlds, perfectly balanced, perfectly adapted, perfectly, imperfectly, beautifully, here. And so the story rests for now, in this stillness, in this quiet appreciation of the long arc of connection, the domestication that was never quite domestication, the wildness that was never quite wild, the relationship that defies easy categorization, that refuses simple explanation, that simply is and has been and continues to be. The cats are sleeping, the world turns, the ancient compact holds, and in the space between human and feline, between wild and tame, between choice and necessity, something rare persists, something precious, something worth celebrating in the deep hours when thought drifts soft and wonder settles gentle, like a cat finding its place and curling, quiet, into rest. There is a world beneath our notice, a world that moves in shadows and sunlight, a world so small and yet so vast that it contains multitudes. And tonight, we step into that world, not as giants, but as quiet observers, watching, listening, noticing the intricate machinery of life that unfolds on scales almost too small to see, Imagine a meadow somewhere distant and quiet, where the grass grows tall and soft, where wildflowers bloom in scattered patches of color, purple and yellow and white, and where the air hangs thick with the scent of earth and pollen. This meadow exists beyond the reach of cities, beyond the hum of traffic and the glow of screens. And in this meadow, time moves differently, measured not in hours or minutes, but in the opening of petals, the arc of the sun, the slow unfurling of wings. We are here to witness something extraordinary, something that has been happening for hundreds of millions of years, long before humans walked upright, long before we built our first shelters or spoke our first words. We are here to observe the insects, those six-legged architects of the natural world, those tiny engineers and gardeners and hunters whose lives unfold in a complexity that rivals our own. The word itself, entomology, comes from the ancient Greek entomon, meaning that which is cut in sections, a reference to the segmented bodies that define these creatures. 3 parts joined together, head and thorax and abdomen, each section a marvel of biological engineering. And the study of these beings, the science of entomology, is the study of persistence, of adaptation, of survival against impossible odds. In this meadow, if we lower ourselves down to where the grass stems tower like trees, we begin to see them. A beetle moves slowly across a leaf, its shell gleaming like polished armor in shades of emerald and copper. Each step is deliberate, methodical, its antennae sweeping the air, reading chemical messages we cannot perceive, testing the world through senses we can barely imagine. Nearby, a butterfly rests on a blade of grass, its wings folded upward like hands in prayer. The wings themselves are miracles, thousands upon thousands of tiny scales, each one a single color, arranged in patterns that create the illusion of smooth gradients, of perfect symmetry. When the wings open, slowly, carefully, they reveal oranges and blacks and whites, warnings to predators, or invitations to mates, or simply the result of millions of years of trial and error, of wings that worked and wings that didn't. The air above the meadow shimmer with motion. Dragonflies patrol invisible territories, their 4 wings beating independently, allowing them to hover, to dart backward, to change direction in the span of a heartbeat. They are hunters, these dragonflies, ancient hunters whose ancestors flew above the swamps of the Carboniferous period, when the air was thick with oxygen and insects grew to impossible sizes, when dragonflies had wingspans as wide as a hawk's. But here, now, in this meadow, the dragonflies are smaller, more delicate, and yet no less magnificent. Their compound eyes, massive and multifaceted, contain thousands of individual lenses, each one capturing a fragment of the world, piecing together a mosaic of movement and light that lets them track the smallest flying insect, calculate its trajectory, and intercept it in midair with a success rate that would shame any human-made machine. And beneath all of this, beneath the flowers and the grass and the visible creatures of the day, there exists another world entirely. The soil itself is alive, teeming with insects we will never see. Beetle larvae curl in chambers of earth, white and soft and blind, slowly consuming decaying matter, transforming death into the nutrients that will feed new life. Ants tunnel through the darkness, creating cities underground, chambers for their young, chambers for their food, highways and byways connecting it all. a civilization that operates on chemical signals and instinct, on roles assigned before birth, on cooperation so complete that the colony itself becomes a kind of superorganism, each ant a cell in a larger body. This is the world we are entering, slowly, carefully, with reverence for its complexity. This is the realm of the small, the overlooked, the essential, and we are here not to conquer or catalog, but simply to witness, to understand, to appreciate the strangeness and the beauty of these lives that unfold in parallel to our own. The evening light begins to soften, turning golden, and the meadow transforms once more. Different creatures emerge, moths beginning their first tentative flights, drawn toward the fading light, their wings dusty and soft, where the butterflies were crisp and bright. And somewhere in the grass, a cricket begins to sing, and then another, and another, until the whole meadow fills with that ancient sound, that rhythm that has marked the coming of night for countless millennia. We have only just arrived, and already there is so much to see. We might begin, as all things begin, with curiosity, with the simple human impulse to look closely at the world, to wonder about the creatures that share our space, that crawl across our paths, that fill the air with their humming. For most of human history, while insects were simply there, part of the background, noticed only when they helped or harmed, when they pollinated crops or devoured them, when they produced honey or spread disease. But somewhere in the distant past, someone paused. Someone watched an ant carrying a burden twice its size, or noticed the perfect geometry of a honeycomb, or wondered why a firefly glowed. And in that pause, in that moment of genuine curiosity, the seeds of entomology were planted. Though the formal science would not emerge for thousands of years, the ancient Egyptians knew insects intimately. The scarab beetle, sacred and symbolic, appeared in their art and their religion. They observed how these beetles rolled balls of dung across the sand, how they buried these spheres in the earth, and how, impossibly, new beetles emerged from the ground weeks later. To the Egyptians, this was resurrection, rebirth. The beetle became a symbol of the sun god Ra, rolling the sun across the sky just as the beetle rolled its precious cargo across the desert. They could not have known, these ancient observers, that the female beetle was laying eggs in that ball of dung, that the larvae would feed and grow in that buried nursery. That metamorphosis would transform the grub into the gleaming adult. They saw only the mystery, the miracle, and they wove it into their understanding of the cosmos. The ancient Greeks turned their philosophers' minds to insects as well. Aristotle, in the 4th century before the Common Era, examined insects with the same careful attention he gave to all living things. He dissected them, studied their structures, tried to understand their purpose in the natural order. In his History of Animals, he described bees and their societies, noting the presence of a leader bee, what he called the king, though we would later discover the ruler of the hive was always a queen. Aristotle believed insects were simpler creatures, born not from eggs or live birth, but from spontaneous generation, from rotting meat or morning dew, from the earth itself. It was an understandable error. When maggots appeared on dead flesh, seemingly from nowhere, what else could one conclude? The truth, that flies laid invisible eggs, that life always came from life. would take nearly 2,000 years to prove conclusively. Still, Aristotle's work mattered. He established the idea that insects were worthy of study, that their small lives contained lessons about the natural world. He noticed the metamorphosis of butterflies, the organization of ant colonies, the construction of spider webs. Even if he misunderstood their origins, he recognized their complexity. The Romans inherited this curiosity. Pliny the Elder, in his massive natural history, compiled everything known about insects in the 1st century of the Common Era. He described silkworms, those caterpillars whose cocoons produced the most prized fabric in the ancient world. He wrote of bees and their honey, of locusts and their devastating swarms, of the purple dye extracted from certain sea snails. His work was less scientific than Aristotle's, more encyclopedic, a gathering of facts and folklore, truth and superstition mixed together, but it preserved knowledge, kept it alive through centuries of change. And then, for a long time, the careful study of insects seemed to pause. The medieval period brought other concerns, other focuses. Insects appeared in bestiaries, those illuminated books of beasts, but they were usually symbolic, moral lessons dressed in 6 legs and wings. The ant represented industry. The spider represented the devil's snares. The butterfly represented the soul. They were metaphors more than subjects of genuine inquiry. But beneath the surface of formal learning, knowledge continued. Farmers understood the rhythms of insect life, knew when the locusts might come, when to expect the beetles that ate their grain. Beekeepers developed sophisticated methods for managing hives, for harvesting honey without destroying the colony, for understanding the cycles of swarming and the seasons of plenty. This was practical entomology, born of necessity, passed down through generations, not in books, but in practice, in observation. In the slow accumulation of working knowledge, the Renaissance changed everything, slowly at first, then faster. The printing press meant knowledge could spread, could be shared and debated and built upon. The development of better lenses, of early microscopes, meant the small world could be magnified, revealed, seen in detail that would have seemed magical to earlier generations. In 1665, a man named Robert Hooke published a book called Micrographia. It contained illustrations of insects and other small creatures as seen through his compound microscope. The drawings were extraordinary. A flea appeared as large as a cat, every segment of its body visible, every hair, every joint, the compound eye of a fly, shown in exquisite detail, revealed the truth of how insects saw the world, not through single lenses like our own, but through hundreds of tiny facets, each one an eye unto itself. Hooke's work did something revolutionary. It made the invisible visible. It proved that insects were not simple, not primitive, but complex beyond imagining, that a creature smaller than a fingernail could contain structures as intricate as any found in larger animals. The book became a sensation. People who had never thought twice about insects suddenly wanted to look closer, to see for themselves these hidden wonders. At the same time, across Europe, naturalists were beginning to challenge old assumptions. Francesco Redi, an Italian physician, performed experiments in the 1670s that finally disproved spontaneous generation, at least for larger organisms. He placed meat in jars, some covered with gauze, some left open. The open jars produced maggots. The covered jars did not. The conclusion was inescapable. The maggots came from flies, from eggs laid by flies, not from the meat itself. It seems obvious now, but at the time it was radical. It meant that every insect, every living thing came from parents, from eggs or live birth, from an unbroken chain of life stretching back through time. It meant the world was even more orderly, more knowable than previously thought. Jan Swammerdam, a Dutch naturalist, took this further. He spent his short life. He died at 43, studying insect anatomy and development. He was particularly fascinated by metamorphosis, that seemingly magical transformation that turned caterpillars into butterflies, grubs into beetles. He dissected caterpillars at different stages, carefully, precisely, and discovered something remarkable. Inside the caterpillar, folded and compressed, the future butterfly already existed. The wings were there, miniature and crumpled, the legs, the antennae, all waiting. All metamorphosis did was allow these structures to unfold, to grow, to become functional. This challenged the idea that metamorphosis was a kind of rebirth. Instead, it was development, predetermined and programmed, unfolding according to rules written in the very structure of the creature. Swammerdam's work was so detailed, so careful, that much of it remained unsurpassed for more than a century. Maria Sibylla Merian, born in 1647, brought art and science together in ways that had never been done before. She was a botanical illustrator, but her real passion was caterpillars. She raised them, fed them, watched them transform, and she painted every stage of their lives with scientific accuracy and artistic beauty. Her paintings showed the host plants, the caterpillar, the chrysalis, the adult butterfly or moth, all together, demonstrating the connections between insects and the plants they depended on. In 1705, at the age of 52, she published Metamorphosis Insectorum Surinamensium, documenting the insects of Suriname, where she had traveled specifically to study tropical species. The book was revolutionary. It showed insects not as isolated curiosities, but as parts of ecosystems connected to plants, to other insects, to the environment. It was ecology before the word existed, but Merian faced obstacles her male contemporaries did not. Her work was sometimes dismissed, attributed to the men who sold her paintings, or ignored entirely by the formal scientific establishment. Still, she persisted, and her illustrations became the gold standard used by naturalists for generations, proving that close observation, patience, and artistic skill could reveal truths that dissection and experimentation alone could not. By the early 1700s, entomology was becoming a discipline. Natural history societies were forming. Collections were being assembled. Wealthy patrons sponsored expeditions to bring back exotic specimens from Asia, Africa, the Americas. Insects were being classified, named, organized into groups based on their characteristics. The sheer diversity was overwhelming. Every expedition brought back hundreds of new species, thousands. There seemed to be no end to the variety of forms that insects could take. Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish botanist who created our modern system of taxonomy, included insects in his great work, Systema Naturae, first published in 1735. He grouped insects by their wing structures, by the number of wings, by whether those wings were hard or soft. covered or exposed. His system was imperfect. It grouped unrelated insects together based on superficial similarities, but it provided a framework, a common language that naturalists across Europe could use to communicate about what they were finding. The 1800s would bring even more better microscopes, the theory of evolution, a deeper understanding of insect life cycles and behaviors. But here, in these early centuries, the foundation was laid. The question had shifted from whether insects were worth studying to how best to study them, from what they symbolized to what they actually were. And in meadows and forests, in gardens and fields, the insects themselves continued their ancient patterns, oblivious to human observation, living out their brief lives with an efficiency and purpose that would inspire wonder in anyone who paused long enough to notice. The 19th century arrived with new tools, new ways of seeing, and an explosion of curiosity about the natural world that would transform entomology from a gentleman's hobby into a rigorous science. The Industrial Revolution was changing landscapes, factories rising, cities expanding, but it also brought precision instruments, better glass, microscopes that could reveal structures no human eye had ever witnessed. In laboratories across Europe, entomologists were discovering that insects possessed abilities that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The flea, that tiny pest, could jump more than 100 times its own body length. If a human could do the same, we would leap over skyscrapers. The mathematics of this were staggering. The flea's legs contained a protein called resilin, more elastic than rubber, storing energy like a compressed spring and releasing it in an explosive burst. This was biomechanics before anyone had coined the term. Charles Darwin, watching the natural world with his uniquely patient eye, saw in insects proof of his revolutionary theory. In 1862, he published a paper on orchids and their pollinators, demonstrating how flowers and insects had evolved together. Each orchid species had a shape, a scent, a color pattern designed to attract specific pollinators. And the insects, in turn, had developed tongues, body shapes, behaviors that allowed them to access the orchid's nectar. It was coevolution, a dance of mutual adaptation stretching back millions of years. Darwin predicted, based on the structure of a Madagascan orchid with a nectar tube nearly a foot long, that there must exist a moth with a tongue of equal length. His contemporaries scoffed. Such a creature seemed impossible, absurd. But 41 years after Darwin's death, in 1903, that moth was discovered. Its scientific name, Xanthopan morgani predicta, the last word meaning predicted, a tribute to Darwin's insight. The moth's proboscis, coiled beneath its head when not in use, could unfurl to nearly 12 inches, reaching deep into the orchid's throat to drink nectar no other creature could access. This was the power of close observation combined with theoretical thinking. Darwin had never seen the moth, but he understood the logic of evolution so deeply that he could predict its existence. And entomology provided endless such examples. Every adaptation, every bizarre structure or behavior made sense when viewed through the lens of survival, of reproduction, of the slow-grinding wheel of natural selection. Jean-Henri Fabre, a French naturalist born in 1823, took a different approach. He was not interested in classification or theory. He wanted to watch insects live, to observe their behaviors in natural conditions for hours, for days, for entire seasons. He built an outdoor laboratory, a plot of land he called his laboratory of the living, and there he studied wasps and bees and beetles with a novelist's eye for detail. Fabre discovered that the hunting wasp possessed a surgical precision. The female wasp, preparing a nest for her young, would hunt specific prey, a cricket or a caterpillar or a grub, depending on her species. When she found her target, she would sting it, not to kill, but to paralyze. The sting was delivered to exact points in the prey's nervous system, shutting down movement while keeping the victim alive. Fresh meat for her larvae. She would then drag this paralyzed creature to her burrow, lay a single egg upon it, and seal the chamber. When the wasp larva hatched, it would feed on the living, paralyzed prey, eating in a specific order, consuming the non-essential organs first, saving the vital ones for last, keeping its food alive and fresh for as long as possible. It was grotesque, efficient, and utterly fascinating. Fabre described it all in prose that read like poetry, making insects into characters, giving their lives narrative weight. His contemporary critics, the laboratory scientists, dismissed his work as too anecdotal, too literary, but Fabre understood something they missed. That behavior was as important as anatomy, that watching how an insect lived revealed truths that dissection never could. His books became bestsellers, translated into dozens of languages, inspiring generations of naturalists to look more carefully at the small dramas unfolding in their own gardens. The late 1800s brought another revolution, the understanding that insects could be vectors of disease. For centuries, people had known that swamps bred illness, that crowded cities suffered plagues, but the connection to insects was unclear. Ronald Ross, a British doctor working in India, proved in 1897 that mosquitoes transmitted malaria. He dissected mosquito after mosquito, examining their stomach walls until he found the malaria parasite developing there. The implications were staggering. Suddenly, insects were not just curiosities or agricultural pests. They were matters of life and death, of public health, of empire and war. The Panama Canal, that massive engineering project, failed in its first attempt largely because yellow fever and malaria killed thousands of workers. It succeeded years later only after aggressive mosquito control measures, draining standing water, screening buildings, eliminating breeding sites. Entomology became strategic, essential, funded by governments and military organizations. But even as insects were being studied for practical reasons, others were discovering their extraordinary sensory worlds. Augustus Forel, a Swiss myrmecologist, devoted his life to understanding ants. He learned that ants communicate primarily through chemical signals, pheromones, leaving trails that others can follow, marking territory, identifying nestmates, coordinating group activities, all through sense we cannot perceive. Forel discovered that if you draw a line through an ant trail with a substance that masks their chemical markers, the ants become confused, lost, their invisible highway erased, but within minutes they reestablish the trail, laying down new scent markers, rebuilding their communication network. He also found that different ant species use different chemical languages, that an ant from one species cannot understand the trails of another, even closely related species. Each colony, each species, operates on its own private frequency, its own secret code. Karl von Frisch, born in 1886, would take the study of insect communication even further. He spent decades studying honeybees, those master navigators and architects. He discovered that bees can see ultraviolet light, wavelengths invisible to human eyes, that flowers appear completely different to a bee, marked with patterns that guide them to nectar like runway lights guiding a plane. He proved that bees use the sun as a compass, that they can navigate even on cloudy days by detecting polarized light in the sky, and most famously, he decoded the waggle dance, that figure-8 movement a foraging bee performs when she returns to the hive. The dance is a map, a set of precise instructions. The angle of the dance relative to the vertical comb indicates the direction to fly relative to the sun. The duration of the waggle portion indicates the distance. A dance lasting 1 second means the food source is about half a mile away. Longer dances indicate greater distances. This was language, symbolic communication, abstract representation in an organism with a brain smaller than a pinhead. Von Frisch's work, published in the 1940s and 50s, shattered assumptions about insect intelligence. He would eventually win the Nobel Prize. One of the few times that prize was awarded for work on invertebrates. Meanwhile, in the early 20th century, entomologists were beginning to understand the true scope of insect diversity. Every expedition to tropical regions returned with thousands of previously unknown species. Estimates suggested that insects might represent more than half of all living species on Earth, perhaps as much as 80%. The sheer number was incomprehensible. Millions of species, each with its own anatomy, its own life cycle, its own ecological role. William Morton Wheeler, an American myrmecologist, argued that an ant colony should be considered a superorganism. The individual ants were like cells in a body, specialized, interdependent, unable to survive alone for long. The colony had a metabolism, consuming resources, producing waste. It had a life cycle. Birth when a new queen established a nest. Growth as the colony expanded. Reproduction when new queens and males flew out to mate. Possibly death if the queen died and was not replaced. This idea that a collective of simple organisms could create something more complex than the sum of its parts influenced fields beyond entomology. It offered insights into organization, cooperation, distributed intelligence. The colony made decisions, chose nest sites, allocated labor, defended territory, but no single ant understood the whole picture. No ant was in charge. The intelligence was emergent, arising from thousands of simple interactions, following simple rules. During the World Wars, entomology took on new urgency. Insects destroyed crops, spread typhus in trenches, threatened armies with disease. The DDT, first synthesized in 1874 but not recognized as an insecticide until 1939, seemed like a miracle. It killed mosquitoes, lice, flies, agricultural pests with extraordinary efficiency and apparent safety. Paul Hermann Müller won the Nobel Prize in 1948 for discovering its insecticidal properties. For a brief moment, it seemed humanity might win the ancient war against insects, eliminate malaria, end crop failures. DDT was sprayed everywhere, in homes, on fields, in massive public health campaigns, and it worked. Malaria was eliminated from entire regions. Crop yields increased. The future looked bright. But Rachel Carson, a marine biologist and writer, was watching the birds. Populations were crashing. Eggs were failing to hatch. Shells too thin to protect the embryos inside. Carson spent years researching, interviewing scientists, examining data, and in 1962 she published Silent Spring. The book documented how DDT accumulated in the food chain, how it persisted in the environment, how it poisoned not just insects, but the birds and fish and mammals that fed on them. The controversy was immediate and fierce. Chemical companies attacked Carson's credentials, her methods, her motives, but the evidence was overwhelming. DDT was indeed persistent, toxic, dangerous. The book launched the modern environmental movement, changed how we thought about pesticides, about unintended consequences, about the interconnectedness of ecosystems. And it reminded entomologists that insects do not exist in isolation, that killing them indiscriminately has ripple effects we are only beginning to understand. Through all of this, through wars and technological revolutions, through changing theories and methodologies, the insects themselves remained constant, adapting, evolving, surviving. In laboratories, they were teaching us about genetics, about disease, about social organization, about flight mechanics and chemical communication, about the fundamental processes of life itself. And in the meadow, our imagined meadow where this journey began, the evening deepens. The moths are flying now, drawn to flowers that bloom white in the darkness, flowers that release their perfume only at night, and the crickets continue their chorus, that sound unchanged since before humans existed, a reminder that we are newcomers to a very old world. The latter half of the 20th century brought technologies that previous generations of entomologists could barely have imagined. Electron microscopes revealed structures at the molecular level, showing how insect wings were constructed scale by scale, how compound eyes were arranged lens by lens. The scanning electron microscope produced images of alien beauty, a mosquito's mouth parts looking like surgical instruments, a butterfly's antenna covered in sensory hairs, like a forest of tiny trees. DNA sequencing, when it finally became possible, revolutionized how we understood insect relationships. Species that looked similar were sometimes only distantly related, while insects that appeared completely different shared recent common ancestors. The evolutionary tree was being redrawn, branch by branch, based not on appearance, but on the genetic code itself, that ancient text written in chains of molecules, telling the story of how life diverged and diversified over hundreds of millions of years. E.O. Wilson, born in 1929, became perhaps the most influential entomologist of the modern era. He began by studying ants, those endlessly fascinating social insects. He and his colleague Bert Hölldobler spent decades documenting ant behavior, communication, ecology. Their book, The Ants, published in 1990, was 800 pages of dense scientific detail, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. Ants became a lens through which to understand evolution, social behavior, chemical communication, ecological dynamics. Wilson identified the concept of island biogeography, working with Robert MacArthur, showing how the size of an island and its distance from the mainland determined how many species could live there. This wasn't just about actual islands. Any isolated habitat, a mountaintop, a forest fragment, a lake, followed the same mathematical relationships. The implications for conservation were profound, as humans fragmented habitats, turning continuous forests into isolated patches. We were creating islands, and those islands could only support so many species. But Wilson's influence extended beyond ants, beyond insects entirely. He popularized the term biodiversity, argued passionately for the importance of preserving species, for understanding ecosystems before we destroyed them. He estimated that we were losing species faster than we could identify them, that tropical forests might contain millions of insect species still unknown to science, and that many would go extinct before they were ever discovered. This realization that we were living through a mass extinction event changed the tone of entomology. The science became more urgent, less about pure curiosity and more about conservation, about understanding what we were losing, about trying to preserve what remained. Entomologists fanned out across the tropics, racing to document species before their habitats disappeared, collecting specimens, recording behaviors, trying to capture snapshots of ecosystems that might not exist in another generation. At the same time, insects were revealing secrets about their own incredible abilities. Scientists discovered that monarch butterflies, those delicate orange and black wanderers, migrated thousands of miles from Canada to specific forests in Mexico, using the sun as a compass, correcting for its movement across the sky throughout the day, using an internal clock to adjust their angle of flight. No individual butterfly made the round trip. The migration took 4 or 5 generations, each one born knowing the route without ever having flown it. The instructions were genetic, inherited, precise enough to guide them to the same trees year after year. Desert locusts, those ancient plagues, were found to transform based on population density. A locust living alone is green, solitary, calm. But when conditions allow populations to explode, when they encounter other locusts frequently, their bodies change, they turn yellow and black, become aggressive, gregarious, form massive swarms that can contain billions of individuals, covering hundreds of square miles, consuming every plant in their path. This was phenotypic plasticity, the same genome producing radically different bodies and behaviors depending on environmental triggers. The molecular biology of metamorphosis was finally understood. Hormones, controlled by day length and temperature, triggered the transformation from larva to pupa to adult. Inside the chrysalis or cocoon, the caterpillar's body essentially dissolved, breaking down into a cellular soup from which the adult structures were assembled, not from scratch but from clusters of cells called imaginal discs that had been present since the larva hatched, waiting dormant for their moment. This wasn't magic, but it was close. A complete reorganization of a living being. Death and a resurrection coded into the genome. Fireflies, those living lanterns of summer nights, were found to produce light through a chemical reaction so efficient that it generated almost no heat. Bioluminescence, achieved through the enzyme luciferase combining with luciferin in the presence of oxygen, creating a glow that was nearly 100% efficient, while our best light bulbs wasted most of their energy as heat, and the flashing patterns, those codes of light in the darkness, were species-specific. Each firefly species had its own rhythm, its own signal. Males flashed while flying, females answered from the grass, a conversation in light leading to mating. But some fireflies were deceptive. females of the genus Photurus learned to mimic the flash patterns of other species. When males of those species approached, expecting a mate, the Photurus female would eat them. This was aggressive mimicry, sexual deception, predation through false advertising. And it worked because the language of light was so precise, so specific, that a correctly timed flash was trusted implicitly. Insects were also teaching us about disease in new ways, not just as carriers, but as subjects for understanding immunity, development, genetics. The fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, became one of the most important organisms in biological research. Its genome was sequenced in 2000, revealing 13,000 genes, many of which had direct counterparts in humans. Studying how genes controlled development in flies gave insights into human development, into birth defects, into cancer, into aging. Thomas Hunt. Morgan's work with fruit flies in the early 1900s established that genes were located on chromosomes, that they were inherited according to mathematical laws. His fly room at Columbia University, crowded with milk bottles full of flies, produced discoveries that earned him the Nobel Prize in 1933. And fruit flies continued to be invaluable, easy to raise, quick to reproduce, with giant chromosomes in their salivary glands that could be seen under basic microscopes. They were the perfect model organism. Meanwhile, in the wild, entomologists were discovering that insect populations were declining, not just rare species, but common ones. Insects that had been abundant were becoming scarce. Long-term studies in Europe showed drops of 75% or more in flying insect biomass over just a few decades. The causes were multiple: habitat loss, pesticides, climate change, light pollution disrupting nocturnal species, death by 1,000 cuts. The implications were staggering. Insects pollinate roughly 85% of flowering plants. They break down dead matter, recycle nutrients, form the base of food chains, feed birds and fish and small mammals. If insect populations collapsed, ecosystems would collapse. We were discovering their importance precisely as we were losing them. The irony was bitter. Some entomologists turned to citizen science, engaging the public in monitoring butterfly populations, counting bees, documenting fireflies. The data was valuable, but more than that, it reconnected people with insects, encouraged them to look closely, to notice what was in their own backyards. Children who might never have thought about insects were suddenly keeping records, learning species names, understanding life cycles, and technology offered new tools for conservation. Genetic analysis could identify illegal trade in protected butterflies, track disease outbreaks in bee populations, determine whether populations were isolated or connected. Drones could survey remote habitats. Automated cameras could monitor rare species. The same technologies that had contributed to environmental damage were being turned toward protection. In laboratories, researchers were exploring how to use insects to solve human problems. Flies were being studied for their extraordinary navigational abilities, their compound eyes and rapid processing inspiring new designs for motion detection sensors. Beetle shells, with their structural colors that needed no pigment, inspired new materials, new paints that would never fade. The water-repellent surface of the Namib desert beetle, which collected fog from the air in one of the driest places on Earth, led to new water harvesting technologies. Ants, with their ability to find efficient paths through complex terrain, inspired algorithms for routing internet traffic, for optimizing delivery routes. Their collective decision-making, choosing nest sites through a distributed voting process, offered models for artificial intelligence for understanding how simple rules could produce complex emergent behaviors. And still, despite centuries of study, despite electron microscopes and gene sequencing and supercomputers running models, insects retained their mysteries. New species were being discovered constantly, not just in remote jungles, but in cities, in well-studied forests, in collections where they had been sitting, misidentified. For decades, each new species raised new questions. How did it make its living? What did it eat? What ate it? How did it fit into its ecosystem? The more we learned, the more we realized how much we didn't know, how many species existed, how many were going extinct before we found them, how ecosystems would respond to their loss, whether populations could recover, whether we could change course before the damage became irreversible. In the meadow, the night deepens further, the moths continue their flight, the crickets their song, and beneath the soil, in chambers and tunnels we cannot see, larvae continue their slow transformation, feeding in darkness, preparing for wings they do not yet possess, for lives they cannot yet imagine. The ancient patterns continue, indifferent to our attention, indifferent to our understanding or lack of it. The insects simply are, doing what they have done for 400 million years, surviving, adapting, filling every available niche with an exuberance and diversity that still, after all this time, takes the breath away. We find ourselves now, not at the end of the story, but at a place of deeper contemplation, standing in the meadow as true darkness settles, looking not just at what insects are or what they have been, but at what they mean, what they reveal about the nature of life itself. Consider the scales of time at work here. A mayfly lives for a single day as an adult, emerging at dawn, mating, laying eggs, dying before sunset, its entire purpose compressed into hours, and yet the nymph stage beneath the water might have lasted a year, 2 years, even 3. Most of its life spent in preparation for a single day of flight. Is this tragedy or efficiency or simply a different way of organizing existence? A cicada of certain species spends 17 years underground, feeding on tree roots, growing slowly in darkness, waiting for a signal we still don't fully understand. And then, in a single coordinated emergence, millions of them surface at once, climb trees, split their skins, unfurl wings, fill the air with sound, mate, and die within weeks. 17 years of waiting for one brief moment of noise and reproduction. The mathematics of this are perfect. 17 is a prime number, making it harder for predators to synchronize their own life cycles to exploit the emergence. These are not conscious decisions. These insects do not choose their strategies, and yet the strategies have worked for millions of years, refined through countless generations, through the brutal editing process of natural selection, where every inefficiency is eventually eliminated. What remains is elegant, even when it seems strange to our eyes, even when it defies what we might consider a good life. The hive mind of bees and ants troubles our assumptions about individuality. We celebrate autonomy, independence, the lone hero making choices, but these insects suggest a different model. The colony as the unit of selection, the individual as expendable. When a honeybee stings a mammal, her barbed stinger tears from her body, and she dies. This makes no sense from an individual perspective, suicide as defense, but for the colony, it makes perfect sense. One bee dies, the intruder is driven away, the hive survives. The bee's sisters, who share 75% of her genes, live to reproduce. From the gene's perspective, the sacrifice is logical, even generous. This challenges our comfortable notions of self, suggests that perhaps individuality is not the only path, not necessarily the best path, that cooperation at the cost of autonomy can produce something remarkable. Cities of insects underground, chambers and tunnels, nurseries and food storage, agriculture. Some ants farm fungus, some aphids are herded like cattle. All this from creatures with brains smaller than a grain of sand. No individual ant understands the whole, but the whole works, thrives, persists. And what of beauty, that word we use so carefully, so subjectively, the butterfly emerging from its chrysalis, wings crumpled and wet, pumping fluid through the veins, watching those wings expand and harden, the pattern revealing itself, orange and black, or blue iridescent, or brown with eye spots that startle predators. This beauty serves a function. Everything serves a function. The colors warn of toxicity, or attract mates, or provide camouflage. There is no art for art's sake in nature. And yet, we cannot help but see it as beautiful. The scarab beetle's metallic sheen, the dragonfly's transparent wings, the firefly's gentle glow. These things move us, speak to something in us that recognizes pattern, symmetry, elegance. Perhaps beauty is not frivolous after all. Perhaps it is the recognition of efficiency, of solutions that work so well they take on an aesthetic dimension, the beauty of mathematics, of physics, embodied in chitin and scales and bioluminescence. The ecological web that insects weave is so complex that we are still mapping it, discovering it. A single oak tree might support hundreds of species of insects, each with its own niche, some eating leaves, and some eating bark, some eating other insects. And those insects feed birds, feed bats, feed spiders and lizards and frogs. The tree is not just a tree, it is a universe. And when we lose a tree or a forest, we lose not just wood, but entire worlds, countless relationships, dependencies we never knew existed. There is something humbling in this, in realizing that the small things, the overlooked things, are not peripheral but central, that we mammals, large and warm-blooded and proud, are the minority, the exception, that the real success story of terrestrial life is written in 6 legs and compound eyes, in metamorphosis and chemical communication, in societies older than our species. Some estimates suggest there are 10 quintillion insects alive at any given moment. That is 10 billion billion, a number so large it becomes abstract, meaningless, and yet each one is an individual with its own brief moment of existence, its own struggle to eat, to avoid being eaten, to reproduce, each one a tiny expression of the same force that drives all life, the blind imperative to continue, to persist, to pass genes forward into an unknowable future. And they do this without fanfare, without expectation of recognition or reward. A dung beetle rolling its sphere across the sand does not know it is recycling nutrients, returning nitrogen to the soil. It knows only the imperative coded in its neurons. Roll the ball, bury the ball, lay the egg. The function emerges from the action, not from understanding. This, too, is instructive. We who overthink, who plan and worry and second-guess, might learn something from the insect's certainty, its commitment to the task at hand, however strange that task might appear to an outside observer. There is a kind of freedom in having no choice, in being what you are without question or doubt. The meadow around us has gone fully dark now. The last light faded from the western sky some time ago, replaced by stars, by the cool silver of a moon not quite full, and the insects of the night are in their element, owning the darkness, navigating by scents and sounds and the faint movements of air. Somewhere a moth finds a flower, uncoils its long proboscis, drinks nectar that tastes of specific sugars, specific compounds. It will fly to another flower, carrying pollen on its fuzzy body, facilitating reproduction for a plant that bloomed specifically for this moment. For these nocturnal visitors, the relationship is ancient, specific, essential. Neither moth nor flower chose this. They inherited it, received it from ancestors stretching back through deep time. The cricket's song continues, will continue through the night, males calling, hoping for a response. The frequency of their chirping changes with temperature, slowing as the air cools. You could calculate the temperature by counting chirps. By knowing the mathematical relationship between heat and muscle contraction, between energy and sound, everything connects, everything relates, through principles of physics and chemistry and biology, all operating at once, in the soil beneath our feet, in the leaf litter and the roots. Larvae continue their transformations, beetles forming in pupal chambers, their adult bodies taking shape, folding and compressing, waiting for the signal that says, it is time to dig upward, time to emerge, time to begin the brief adult phase with its imperatives of feeding and mating and dispersing. And in the tree above, a colony of ants settles for the night, activity slowing but never stopping entirely. Some workers still patrol, still tend the brood, still maintain the nest. The colony breathes, if we can use that word, cycles of activity and rest, but never complete stillness, always some subset awake, alert, ready. This has been happening here, in this meadow and places like it, for longer than we can properly comprehend. Long before humans, long before mammals, long before the first flower bloomed. Insects were here, different forms perhaps, different species certainly, but recognizable. Six-legged and segmented, compound-eyed and antennaed, the basic body plan proven successful, maintained across hundreds of millions of years of change, and it will continue after us. This seems certain. Insects survived the extinction that took the dinosaurs, survived ice ages and volcanic winters and asteroid impacts. They are resilient in ways large animals are not, small enough to hide, numerous enough to endure catastrophic losses and recover, diverse enough that some species will survive almost any calamity. They will be here in some form long after we are gone, still pollinating, still decomposing, still filling the air with their humming and the night with their song. There is comfort in this continuity, in knowing that some patterns are too old, too tested, too fundamental to break easily. The metamorphosis will continue, the emergence will continue. The ancient dance of predator and prey, of pollinator and flower, of parent and offspring will continue. We are privileged to witness it, to study it, to begin to understand the complexity and beauty of these small lives. And perhaps, if we are wise, we will learn to live alongside them more gently, to preserve the habitats they need, to make room in our world for their world, to recognize that their flourishing and ours are not separate things, but intertwined, dependent, necessary to each other in ways we are still discovering. The night deepens. The meadow settles into its rhythms, and somewhere in the grass or in the trees or beneath the soil, a life is beginning, a transformation occurring, a tiny drama playing out with no audience but the stars. And this is enough. This has always been enough. Life continuing, adapting, persisting, in forms small and strange and utterly essential. The insects carry on, as they have always carried on, and the world turns, and the seasons cycle, and the ancient patterns hold, and we can simply stand here in the darkness, listening to the crickets, watching for the occasional firefly, breathing the cool night air, grateful to be part of this vast living tapestry, this planetary experiment in diversity and resilience, this beautiful, endlessly complex, quietly miraculous world